I was 23 when my dad's friend, Bill, let me borrow his hunting cabin for the weekend. This was in the fall of 2011, late October, in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. The cold had already started creeping in, but the snow hadn't fully arrived yet. Just a biting wind and dead leaves crunching underfoot. Bill's cabin sat on 80 acres of thick woods, mostly oak and pine, with a swampy creek cutting through the back end of the property. It was a decent place, nothing fancy. One bedroom, a wood stove, a propane-powered fridge, and a small generator if I needed it. No running water, just a hand pump outside. He had a few trail cameras set up around the land, mostly for deer, and he told me I could check them if I wanted. I planned on hunting that weekend. Just me, my .30-06, and the woods. No cell service, no distractions. I wasn't worried about being alone. I'd hunted solo before, spent nights in the woods with nothing but a tent and a rifle. I wasn't some rookie camper, but that weekend something was different. Something about that place stuck with me in a way I still can't shake. I got to the cabin around 3 p.m., just as the sun started dipping behind the trees. The wind had picked up, whistling through the pines, sending dead leaves skittering across the ground. The cabin was just as Bill described. Small, a little musty, but solid. I unloaded my gear, checked the generator, it worked fine, and got a fire going in the wood stove. By the time I stepped back outside, the sky had gone a deep blue. The air smelled like cold dirt and distant pine. I stood on the porch, looking out at the tree line. I had the strange feeling that someone had been here recently. The ground around the cabin looked normal. No fresh tracks, no sign of anything unusual, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I set up my rifle by the door, double-checked the locks, and turned in early. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a sound outside. Not a loud noise, not anything obvious, just something off, like footsteps in the leaves, but too slow, too deliberate. I sat up in my sleeping bag, listening. The wind had died down, leaving only the soft creaking of trees. Then, another sound, closer, a dry, shuffling step. I grabbed my rifle and slid out of bed. The window beside me was too dark to see anything. I waited, listening. Nothing, just the silence of the woods. After a while, I convinced myself it was a deer or maybe the wind pushing a branch against the ground. I eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I decided to check Bill's trail cameras before heading out to hunt. He had 3 of them set up along different trails leading to a clearing where deer usually fed. I started with the one closest to the cabin, about 200 yards away. I popped the SD card into my camera and flipped through the pictures. Deer, raccoons, a few coyotes. Normal stuff. Then I got to a photo taken the night before, right around the time I'd heard the noises outside the cabin. The picture showed the clearing, dark except for the camera's flash. In the center of the frame was a man. No gun, no hunting gear, just a man, standing in the middle of the clearing, facing the camera. His clothes were dark, his face barely visible in the flash. I stared at the photo, my pulse pounding. There was no reason for anyone to be out here. The nearest property was miles away. I checked the next few photos. They were empty, just trees and darkness. I told myself it had to be some lost hiker, maybe some poacher passing through. But something about the way he stood in the picture, the way he faced the camera so directly, unsettled me. I put the SD card back and hiked to the next camera. The second camera was about a half-mile deeper into the woods, along a game trail. I checked it, flipping through the pictures. Then I saw him again. Same guy, same dark clothing, but this time he was closer. He stood just at the edge of the trees, half hidden in shadow, watching something off camera. I clicked to the next photo. Gone. I looked up from the camera, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. The woods were dead quiet. I suddenly felt exposed, like I was being watched. I gripped my rifle tighter and made my way back to the cabin, checking over my shoulder the whole way. That night, I locked the cabin up tight. I kept the rifle next to me, the safety off. Around 1 a.m., I woke up again. This time, it wasn't just footsteps. It was breathing, slow, heavy, just outside the window. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I just lay there, gripping the rifle. The breathing went on for what felt like forever. Then, a slow, dragging sound, like something being pulled through the leaves. Then silence. I stayed awake until dawn. To first light, I packed up. I didn't care about hunting anymore. I didn't care about checking the last trail camera. I just wanted to get the hell out. But as I stepped onto the porch, I stopped. There, in the dirt, were footprints. They led from the woods, circled the cabin twice, then stopped directly beneath my bedroom window. Whoever it was had stood there, watching me sleep. I didn't waste time. I threw my gear in the truck, locked the cabin behind me, and tore down that dirt road faster than I should have. I didn't tell Bill the full story, just that I saw someone on the trail cameras, maybe a trespasser. He didn't seem too worried. Said he'd check it out next time he was up there. I never went back, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear those slow, shuffling steps in my head. The sound of someone standing outside, just listening. And I know without a doubt that whoever it was, they weren't lost. They weren't just passing through. They were waiting. The summer was waning, and the crisp bite of autumn hadn't quite settled in. I needed to escape. Too much noise, too many people, the city. Everything had begun to feel overwhelming. So, I decided to rent a small cabin in the mountains of Montana. It was just me and the quiet for the next 2 weeks. Peace, or so I thought. The cabin was an old log house nestled at the base of a dense pine forest, miles from the nearest neighbor. It had been built decades ago, and everything about it screamed solitude. I could tell it wasn't exactly in pristine condition, but that suited me just fine. I wanted isolation, not luxury. The year was 2025, and I was 32, old enough to appreciate the peace of being alone, but still young enough to crave some adventure. When I arrived, the weather was fine. A few clouds, the faintest chill in the air, the sort of crispness that hints at what's to come, but nothing to worry about just yet. I spent the first few hours unloading my gear, setting up the inside of the cabin. It was a one-room affair, wooden floors, a stone fireplace, a small kitchen nook, and a set of mismatched furniture. The windows were thick with dust, but the view outside more than made up for it. Pine trees stretched endlessly in every direction, with nothing but the sound of the wind rustling through the branches. Perfect. My phone didn't get any signal out here, and the only sign of civilization was a dirt road that snaked off into the wilderness. That first evening, I spent my time exploring the area around the cabin, getting my bearings. The forest was dense but manageable, though a few trails had been clearly overgrown for years. I took note of some of the landmarks: an old creek, a large rock outcrop, a clearing where the sun broke through the trees like a spotlight. I gathered firewood and made sure I knew where the water was, just in case. The wind picked up as the sun dipped behind the mountains, and by nightfall, the temperature dropped considerably. It was colder than I'd anticipated, and I found myself stoking the fire a bit more than I'd planned. I cooked some canned chili for dinner, then read for a while by the fire before turning in for the night. The first few days passed uneventfully, the kind of peace I was looking for. I hunted small game, rabbits and squirrels, and spent hours by the creek fishing. I didn't see another soul. No hikers, no campers. Just me and the wilderness. At night, I'd listen to the wind, the occasional howl of a coyote, or the distant hoot of an owl. Nothing out of the ordinary, just nature doing its thing. But on the fourth day, something changed. I woke up early, as I usually did, and stepped outside to start the morning fire. The air was colder than usual, and there was a heaviness to the silence.
No birds, no insects.
The wind was still and the forest felt too quiet. It made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. At first, I chalked it up to the weather, maybe a storm was coming. But the feeling lingered, nagging at the back of my mind. I decided to spend the day inside, staying warm and dry while the storm passed. It rained heavily in the afternoon, a steady downpour that turned the dirt road into mud. I watched it from the window as the trees swayed, bending under the weight of the rain. The fire crackled in the corner, and I was content to read and sip coffee, thinking it would blow over by evening. But when night fell, the unease I'd been feeling all day only deepened. I sat by the fire, the wind howling outside, and kept hearing sounds I couldn't place. Scraping noises, almost like something moving just outside the cabin walls. It was faint, so faint that I thought maybe I was imagining it. But then I heard it again, a sharp scraping sound, followed by what almost sounded like a soft, deliberate thump. I stood up, my heart pounding a little faster. I checked the door locks, then peered out the window, my breath fogging up the glass. The storm had cleared, but the night was pitch black, and the moon was hidden behind thick clouds. I saw nothing but trees and shadows. Maybe it was an animal, perhaps a raccoon or some kind of rodent. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't. The noises continued for the next hour, getting louder. It felt like something was out there, moving around the cabin. I kept telling myself it was just the wind, that it was just the way the trees groaned in the storm. But the sounds were too specific, too intentional. And there was something about them that set my nerves on edge. Around midnight, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my rifle, opened the door, and stepped out onto the porch. The night air was cold against my skin, and the darkness stretched out in all directions. I scanned the perimeter of the cabin, but I saw nothing. The ground was soft from the rain, and there were no tracks, nothing that looked out of place. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I checked the woodpile, then the area around the cabin. I found nothing. No footprints, no sign of anything unusual. Yet the unease didn't leave me. The next morning, things seemed normal again. The sun was out, the forest was alive with the usual sounds of birds and insects, and I felt a bit foolish for letting my imagination get the best of me. But then, later that afternoon, I found something in the woods. It wasn't far from the clearing I had discovered a few days earlier, near the creek. At first, I thought it was just an old tree stump, but as I got closer, I realized it was something much darker, something strange. A pile of broken twigs and leaves formed a rough, low mound, and scattered around it were animal bones. Some of them were fresh, still with bits of fur and flesh attached. Others were older, weathered and bleached by the sun. But what caught my attention most were the two human-like footprints in the mud, just a few feet away from the pile. They were large, deep, and oddly shaped. The toes were splayed unnaturally wide, like something had been walking on all fours. I stood frozen, staring at the prints. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I was no expert, but those prints didn't look like any animal I knew. They looked wrong. And the bones, I tried to convince myself it was just some strange predator or scavenger, but deep down, I knew better. I headed back to the cabin with my mind spinning. I locked the door and stayed inside for the rest of the day, even though the sun was still high in the sky. That night, I heard the noises again. Scraping, thumping. This time, it was more persistent, almost rhythmic. Like whatever it was trying to get in. I checked every lock, every window, every corner of the cabin. I couldn't find anything out of place, but the sounds kept coming. I felt it then, the distinct sensation that something was out there, watching, waiting, couldn't sleep. I sat by the fire, rifle in hand, my eyes darting around the cabin, listening for any sign of movement. Hours passed, and nothing happened. Eventually, I must have drifted off, because I woke to the sound of the door creaking open. I leapt up, heart hammering in my chest, but it was too late. The door was already wide open. I grabbed my rifle and rushed outside, but the night was still, silent. There was no one around. No signs of struggle, no signs of anything unusual, except for the door, which had been opened from the outside. I spent the next 2 days in a haze of fear and confusion, my paranoia growing. Every time I stepped outside, I was acutely aware of how exposed I was, how alone. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, following me, watching, waiting for the right moment. On the 3rd day after the door was opened, I finally made up my mind. I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed up all my things, checked the cabin one last time, and drove back down the mountain. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something following me, but there was nothing, just the endless stretch of wilderness behind me. I didn't look back. I don't know what it was, if it was a person, a group, or something else entirely, but I knew I couldn't risk staying there. It was a feeling that would haunt me for years, one I couldn't shake. The cabin, the forest, the sounds, they all still linger in the back of my mind. I never returned to that place. I didn't want to know what was really out there, and I sure as hell didn't want to find out. I didn't plan on spending the night at that cabin. It wasn't supposed to happen that way, but as often happens, the universe has its own plans, and mine that day were to be disrupted by something I didn't understand. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend camping trip to clear my head. I needed it. Work had been suffocating me, and the constant noise of city life had started to feel like a weight. So, I decided to head out to the mountains, to a spot I'd been to a few times before. Peace and quiet, nature at its best.
No distractions.
Just me, my tent, and the trees. But things never go according to plan, do they? I'd parked my truck on the side of a dirt road, a few miles away from any real trailhead. It was late afternoon, maybe 4 p.m. The air was already starting to cool, and the sun was low enough in the sky to cast long, angled shadows across the land. There was a chill in the air, but it wasn't unbearable. I started to walk, my boots crunching over the ground, the smell of pine filling the air, the kind of smell you could breathe in all day and still want more of. It didn't take long for the path to disappear, swallowed up by dense underbrush. My map wasn't much help either. I wasn't entirely sure where the trail was supposed to go. All I knew was that there was a small, isolated cabin near a graveyard up ahead, according to the trail guides I had read. A curious location, but I figured it was just another historical site. Nothing to worry about. The woods around me were quiet, aside from the occasional rustle of a squirrel or the distant call of a bird. As I walked further into the trees, the light began to fade faster, the shadows growing longer. I started to feel a little uneasy, but I figured I was just overthinking things. Then I saw it, just a glimpse at first, a faint outline in the distance through the trees. A cabin, old and worn, standing on the edge of a small clearing. My heart skipped a beat, not from fear, but from the fact that it was exactly what I had been looking for. I approached cautiously, stepping over the uneven ground and around fallen logs. The cabin was small, made of weathered wood, with a sagging roof that looked like it had seen better days. The windows were grimy, and there was no sign of life, no smoke rising from the chimney. It didn't look like anyone had been there in a long time. As I got closer, I noticed something else. A cemetery, small but present, behind the cabin. Old gravestones, weathered, cracked, and leaning at odd angles, stood scattered across the clearing. Most of them were so old that the names had worn away, but a few still had faint carvings. I couldn't make out much, but one of the stones had a date from the 1800s. This place had been forgotten by time. A shiver ran down my spine, though I couldn't say why. It wasn't anything supernatural. It wasn't the graves themselves, just the way they seemed to be quietly watching, like remnants of something long past. I didn't think much of it at first. I figured I could set up camp near the cabin. It would give me some shelter in case the weather turned, and I was far enough from civilization that I wouldn't be disturbed. I knocked on the door. No response. I tried the handle. It was unlocked. I stepped inside. The air inside was stale and musty, filled with the scent of decay and mildew. Dust covered the floor, thick and undisturbed, except for a few areas where something or someone had recently moved. A single chair sat in the corner, a table beside it with a half-empty glass of what looked like old, dried tea. The place had been abandoned for years, but it didn't feel abandoned. Felt watched. I hesitated, but then, with the fading light outside and the realization that I didn't want to camp alone in the wilderness after dark, I decided to settle in for the night. I made a quick fire in the old stove, though it struggled to catch at first. After a few attempts, it finally roared to life, filling the cabin with warmth. I unrolled my sleeping bag in one of the corners, near the small window where I could see the cemetery clearly. As I sat by the fire, the evening stretched on. The wind began to pick up, rustling the trees and sending occasional rattling noises through the walls. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath. Then a noise, not from the wind. It was a faint sound, almost imperceptible, like a shuffle of footsteps. I froze. The sound came from outside, just beyond the window where I could see the graves. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer, a raccoon. I stood up, peering through the grime-covered glass. There was nothing, no movement, just the shadows of trees swaying in the wind. I told myself I was being paranoid, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. It gnawed at the back of my mind. A few hours passed. The fire had burned down to embers, and I lay awake in the dark, unable to sleep. That was when I heard it again. The shuffling. This time it was closer, right outside the cabin. My pulse quickened. I held my breath. Nothing. Then, the sound of something soft, almost like a scrape, followed by a low thud. I stood up slowly, heart pounding in my chest. I grabbed a flashlight and quietly moved toward the door. My breath came in short bursts, and my hands shook as I gripped the handle. I opened it just enough to peek outside. There, standing in the graveyard, was a figure, tall, thin, and unmoving. My heart hammered in my chest, and for a moment, I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I couldn't think. It wasn't just that someone was out there. It was the way the figure stood. Still, like it wasn't even breathing. I snapped the door shut, locking it behind me. I backed into the cabin, my mind racing. There was no way anyone could have come out here. The road was miles away. I was alone, but I wasn't. I stayed as still as I could, listening for any more sounds. But the air was thick with silence. I couldn't take it anymore. I decided I needed to leave. The first step I took was almost too loud in the silence. My mind was telling me to run, to get out, to do anything to escape. But as soon as I stepped toward the door, something caught my eye through the window. The figure was still out there, but now it was closer. I could see it clearly, standing just outside the cabin. And then it moved. It didn't walk. It slid. It was like its limbs were too long and too unnatural to move properly. The figure glided across the yard, closer and closer. And then it stopped, right in front of the cabin, right at the window. I pressed myself against the wall, my breath shallow and quick. My hands were sweating, but I couldn't make myself move. Time passed. It felt like hours, though it could have been minutes. I don't know how long I waited. Finally, I heard it, the sound of footsteps walking away slowly at first, then faster. The sound of shuffling dirt. The figure was gone, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out what else might happen. I grabbed my pack, shoved my flashlight into the side pocket, and ran. I didn't stop until I reached the truck. My mind was still reeling from what I had seen. My heart was still pounding in my chest. I didn't look back at the cabin. Couldn't. I didn't tell anyone what happened that night. Who would believe me? Who would understand? But I know what I saw. There was something out there, and it was waiting for me. The rain started just as I was finishing the last nail in the wooden frame of the cabin. It wasn't supposed to rain tonight. In fact, the forecast said it would be clear for at least another week. But as I stood up, wiping the sweat off my forehead, the first droplets hit the back of my neck. I felt the chill run down my spine before I even heard the thunder rolling in the distance. The storm, it seemed, was arriving early. I wasn't prepared for it, not at all. But then again, I hadn't planned on being out here this long. A week of hunting and building, that was supposed to be all I needed. But now, here I was with a half-built cabin, a full rainstorm, and a night that I was sure would test every bit of resolve I had. I hadn't expected to be alone. There was supposed to be a friend of mine, Jake, coming to help me finish things up. But he bailed out last minute, claiming he had work commitments. He didn't sound so sure about it when he backed out. I wasn't angry, though. It was his decision, and I needed this time on my own. The solitude felt necessary, like I had to prove something to myself. The storm really hit hard just after sunset, and the sky was a blur of dark clouds and streaks of lightning that seemed to split the night open. I threw my jacket on, grabbed the hammer, and walked out of the cabin to collect some of my tools. They were scattered about from my attempts to finish building the walls, and it had started to rain harder. The tools were getting soaked. I was only supposed to be out here for a few more hours, just enough time to finish the roof, tie up a few loose ends, then head to the nearby town for a hot meal and a warm bed. But now, with the storm picking up, there was no way I could make it back to the truck in this weather. The dirt road would be too muddy, and the visibility was getting worse by the minute. Couldn't risk it. I made the decision right there to stay. I had enough food to last a couple of days. There were no other shelters nearby. This little cabin would have to do. The floor wasn't done, but I had enough room inside to roll out my sleeping bag. I had a small camp stove I could use to heat up some canned soup, and I thought it would be okay to make the best of it. At least the roof would keep the rain out, if nothing else. But something about that night, something in the air, felt wrong. The silence of the woods had always been something I loved. But tonight, the quiet was suffocating. The wind howled through the trees, the branches scraping against each other like bones. It wasn't the usual peaceful sound of the forest. It felt heavier, like something was watching, something was waiting. I dismissed the feeling, though. I told myself it was just my imagination, the isolation getting to me. As the hours passed and the rain came down harder, the storm outside seemed to build up, as if the heavens themselves were at war with the earth. I sat in the corner of the cabin, wrapped in my sleeping bag, listening to the wind pound against the walls. The flames in my tiny stove flickered and crackled, providing the only light and warmth in the dark, cold cabin. The smell of damp wood mixed with the faint, metallic scent of the soup I was heating up. I didn't expect anything unusual, nothing at all. But then I heard it. It was faint at first, just a soft, rhythmic tapping on the roof. I paused, trying to listen through the storm. I thought it was just rain at first. Maybe the trees were shaking in the wind, sending drops of water splattering onto the cabin. But no, this wasn't just the rain. The tapping was too deliberate, too consistent. It was like someone or something was knocking on the roof, a steady, persistent rhythm that didn't quite fit with the storm. I stood up, my heart suddenly hammering in my chest. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped cautiously toward the door. It was too dark to see anything outside through the small window, but the tapping continued, growing louder, now joined by what sounded like scratching. The sound sent a chill up my spine. For a moment, I just stood there, frozen. The wind howled outside, and the rain pounded against the cabin. But the scratching, that constant, unnerving scraping, was now the only thing I could hear. I wanted to dismiss it. I wanted to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe an animal, maybe branches rubbing together. But something told me that it wasn't. It wasn't natural. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door, and the rain hit me like a wall. I could barely see more than a few feet in front of me. The storm was so thick. I shone the flashlight around, looking for anything that might be out of place. There was nothing, just trees, just the endless rows of dark, wet trunks stretching off into the night. The sound stopped the moment I stepped outside. The air was so thick with rain that it felt suffocating. I scanned the ground, looking for tracks or any sign of movement, but there was nothing. I backed up into the cabin quickly, closing the door behind me. My hands were shaking, and I felt a growing sense of unease settle in my chest. The feeling wasn't going away. Something wasn't right. I decided to sleep. It was the only thing I could do. The night felt endless, the storm relentless. I curled up in my sleeping bag, wrapped myself tightly in the blanket, and closed my eyes. But sleep didn't come easy. Every sound, every creak of wood, every gust of wind made me jump, heart pounding in my chest. And then there was the tapping again. I tried to ignore it. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind or something else. But this time, the tapping was coming from somewhere else. It wasn't on the roof anymore. It was coming from the wall of the cabin. Light, rapid taps that didn't belong. Not natural, not rain. I turned to face the wall, my breath catching in my throat. I felt the weight of the silence press down on me again. The tapping was now louder, more distinct. It seemed to be coming from the far corner of the cabin, where the shadows were the deepest. I strained to hear, to understand, but the pounding rain outside drowned everything out. And then, for a moment, it stopped. Absolute silence. Even the storm outside seemed to fade away. Then came the scratching, louder, sharper this time, followed by a soft, muffled thud against the wall. My heart skipped a beat. I jumped up, grabbing the flashlight again. My hand was slick with sweat as I shone the beam around, trying to make sense of what was happening. The cabin seemed to close in on me. The walls felt too tight, too enclosing. I approached the corner cautiously, my every step echoing in the hollow space. The air was thick with moisture, and I could taste the metal of the storm in the back of my throat. The shadows in the corner seemed to deepen as I moved closer. The scratching started again, this time from the floor. My flashlight beam fell on the wooden boards beneath me, and that's when I saw it. A small crack, a thin, barely visible gap between two planks. Something small and hidden was scratching from the other side. I could hear it so clearly now, the sound cutting through the storm. I didn't wait any longer. I dropped to my knees and pried the boards apart. The storm outside seemed to freeze as I did, the world holding its breath. Beneath the floorboards was a small hollow space, dark and damp. I pushed my hand inside, feeling around until I found something cold and smooth. It was a small metal box, buried beneath the wood. I pulled it out, trembling. When I opened the box, I found nothing but dirt. It was empty, save for a few scattered twigs and leaves. The box itself was old, its surface rusted. But there was something deeply unsettling about the way it had been hidden in the floor. the way it had felt like it was waiting for me to find it. And then, with the box in my hand, I heard the sound again. A distant voice, muffled by the rain and wind, calling out from somewhere deep in the woods. I didn't need to know who it was. The weight of the storm, the scratching in the walls, the strange emptiness of the box. Everything hit me at once. The sense of dread was overwhelming, but there was a clarity in the moment, too. It wasn't about ghosts or any kind of supernatural explanation. It was about survival. It was about understanding that nature has its own way of reclaiming what's lost. And sometimes, it doesn't let you leave. I put the box back into the floor, closed the boards, and made my way to the door. The storm outside still raged, but the rain didn't seem as threatening now. The air felt lighter, and I knew, for some reason, that I could make it through the night. The scratching stopped. The wind died down. The storm eventually moved on. I slept that night, the first peaceful sleep I'd had in a long time. When I woke up, the sun was out, and the world seemed calmer. The cabin still stood, quiet and still, surrounded by the trees and the calm after the storm. I left the next day, the road back to town clear, the air fresh and crisp. I never saw the box again, and I never mentioned it to anyone. But something changed after that night. The woods were no longer just a place for hunting or building. They had a history, something deep and forgotten. And I wasn't in a hurry to return. Sometimes the best way to survive out there is to leave the past where it belongs, buried. I had always thought I was done with the past, but sometimes life drags you back. After my divorce from Laura, I never thought I'd end up near her again, let alone visit that cabin. It wasn't just any cabin. It was the one she'd taken me to on our honeymoon. Nestled deep in the woods, hours from the nearest town, it had been her escape, and for a time it had been mine too. But that was before everything fell apart. That was before I saw her for who she really was, before the lies stacked up and the trust shattered. Still, when she called me about the place, my heart tightened. She was selling it. Something about needing a clean break from the past. Or maybe it was her new life with the sheriff, Steve. He was a cop too, the kind of guy who always had to be the hero. Maybe that was what drew her to him, or maybe it was the way she loved to have control. "Can you help me clean it out?" she asked, her voice distant on the phone. I know it's a lot to ask, but I can't do it alone. I could hear Steve in the background, laughing at something, probably at her expense. It irritated me more than it should have. I told her I'd think about it. The cabin had been one of my favorite places before everything went south. I had nothing left to do that weekend, so I decided to go. It was a long drive up there, the kind that felt like it was pulling you further and further away from civilization. The narrow 2-lane road twisted and turned, going deeper into the forest with every mile. The trees, mostly pine, stood tall and endless, blocking out the sunlight in some areas, making the drive feel like an endless journey through shadow. I remembered the sound of the leaves crunching underfoot, the smell of pine resin and damp earth, how we used to walk down the same road hand in hand, carefree. But that was years ago. Now it felt like a ghost of what it once was. The cabin appeared in the distance. It wasn't much, just a small wood frame house, a little crooked in places, but with a charm that couldn't be denied. It had a stone chimney with moss clinging to the edges. The windows, a little fogged up and cracked, still let in a faint light. When I pulled up, Laura's car was already there. I didn't know what to expect. Maybe she'd be the same as I remembered, or maybe she'd be different. It didn't matter. I was here to finish what she needed done. I took a deep breath before stepping out of the truck. The air felt thick with moisture and the weight of the past. The porch creaked under my weight as I approached the door, and when I knocked, I heard her footsteps from inside. It wasn't long before the door opened, and there she was. She hadn't changed much. Same blonde hair, same tight smile, but her eyes were different. There was something hollow about them, something tired, as though she'd been carrying too much and couldn't put it down. "Thanks for coming," she said, stepping aside to let me in. The inside was just as I remembered. The same old furniture, the same chipped wooden floors. The fire pit in the center, with remnants of burned-out logs scattered in the ash. It was like a time capsule frozen in place. The cabin smelled the same too, a mix of wood and old leather furniture. But as I looked around, I noticed something. The pictures on the walls, our pictures, had been taken down. There were new ones now, ones I didn't recognize. The feeling of familiarity mixed with discomfort, like walking into someone else's home, even though it was mine once. Laura gestured for me to sit down by the fireplace. "I know it's a lot to go through," she said, her voice quieter now, almost apologetic. I nodded, not sure what to say. I was here to help, and that's what I'd do. No sense in making things harder than they had to be. The first couple of hours were spent clearing out the cabinets and drawers, tossing old junk into boxes and bags. The silence between us was thick, each of us trying to avoid the obvious truth: we were done. No matter how much time we spent here, no matter how much we tried to pretend, there was no going back. It wasn't until I started clearing out the old bedroom that things began to feel off. The room was covered in dust, untouched for years. I found an old photo album buried under some old blankets, and as I flipped through it, I saw pictures of us, our happier days. A sick feeling rose in my stomach. What had happened? How had we let it all fall apart? I set the album down and was about to turn when I noticed something strange. There was a small door in the back corner of the room. It had been there all along, but I didn't remember it. It was smaller than a regular door, barely noticeable unless you were paying attention. Laura had walked in behind me, and I saw her stiffen when she saw the door. That used to be the closet," she said, her voice shaky. I don't know why I never told you about it." I looked at her, confused. "It's a weird spot for a closet." "Yeah, it's always been strange," she muttered. "Maybe I'll go check it out later." Something in her tone made me uneasy. It wasn't just the words, but the way she said them, like she was trying to bury something. I didn't want to push it, but my curiosity got the better of me. "Let me take a look," I said, walking toward the door. It didn't seem like much, just a small, barely visible closet door. I twisted the knob and it opened with a soft creak. What I found inside was nothing like what I expected. The small room behind it was cramped, almost suffocating. The air smelled stale, and there was barely any light. There, in the middle of the floor, was an old chest. It was rusted, covered in dust, and chained shut. Laura was standing in the doorway now, her face pale. "You shouldn't open that," she said, almost pleading. But I didn't listen. I was already crouching down, reaching for the lock. There was something about it that drew me in. Maybe it was the way she reacted, or maybe it was just the fact that I was here doing this and nothing could feel right anymore. With a grunt, I pried the lock open and lifted the lid. Inside, there was a pile of old clothes rotting with age, but beneath that was something far worse. There were several old photographs covered in dirt. At first, I couldn't make out what they were, but as I sifted through them, I froze. They were pictures of the cabin, of different parts of the property. But there was one thing that stood out. They were taken from a distance, like someone had been watching. My heart started to race. This wasn't normal. Something wasn't right. I turned to Laura, holding one of the photos in my hand. Her face had gone white, her eyes wide with panic. "I knew it," she whispered. "I knew it was here. I should have told you." Before I could ask her what she meant, a noise came from outside. Faint at first, like someone was walking around the cabin. But this wasn't the wind. This wasn't an animal. This was the sound of heavy footsteps. They were deliberate, slow, and they weren't alone. Laura grabbed my arm, pulling me away from the chest. "We need to get out of here," she said, her voice trembling. I stood there for a moment trying to process everything. The photos, the footsteps, the way she was acting. It was all too much. But then the sound got closer, louder, and that's when I heard it. A voice, muffled, almost like a whisper. "Come outside," it called. But there was no one there. I turned to Laura, but she was already moving. Without saying another word, she rushed for the door, pulling me along with her. The cabin felt like it was closing in, the walls creeping in on us as we stepped outside. My mind raced. Who was out there? Why hadn't Laura told me about this sooner? When we reached the front porch, I stopped. The footsteps had stopped too. It was quiet now, too quiet. And then, a figure appeared at the edge of the woods, just outside the reach of the cabin's light. I couldn't make out who it was, but I knew one thing. They were watching us. That was when I realized we weren't alone. And whatever had been hiding in those woods wasn't just an old memory. It was real. It wasn't a ghost or some fairy tale monster. It was something worse. Something that had been waiting for years. The sound of the footsteps resumed, but this time, they were right behind us. It was early fall when I decided to take a break from the hustle of my everyday life. I needed some time away from the city, away from people, and away from the noise. So, I packed up my gear, grabbed my rifle, and made my way to a small hunting cabin I had rented in the mountains of northeastern Idaho. The cabin was remote, far enough from town that you wouldn't hear a thing except the wind and the rustle of leaves. It was the perfect place to escape. The drive was long. I had to head north on Route 95, a highway that stretched through winding roads and thick forests. The map showed I'd be about 30 miles from the nearest town, but it felt like an eternity. I passed old wooden fences, open fields, and occasionally, a weather-beaten farmhouse. Eventually, the paved roads gave way to gravel, and I found myself bumping along the narrow, winding path leading deeper into the wilderness. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon when I finally saw the cabin. It was nestled between towering pines, the kind of place you only see in the pictures on postcards. Simple, a little worn, but it had a charm to it. I pulled up the dirt driveway, my truck's tires crunching against the gravel. There was a faint smell of wood smoke in the air, likely from a nearby neighbor or an old wood-burning stove. The cabin sat there, quiet, still, and waiting. I grabbed my things and headed inside. The interior of the cabin was just as I expected, rustic, but cozy. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, its chimney rising up through the roof. There was an old leather chair in front of the fire, a wooden table in the center, and shelves lined with hunting trophies, mounted deer heads, and a collection of old hunting magazines. The scent of pine and earth filled the air, mixed with a faint mustiness from the cabin's long history. I didn't waste much time unpacking. After setting my bags down, I grabbed my rifle and headed out the back door. The surrounding forest seemed endless, stretching as far as I could see. The ground was damp from the recent rain, the air cool and crisp. It was peaceful, a little too peaceful maybe, but I liked it that way. I planned to do some hunting the next morning, but for tonight, I was content just to sit and enjoy the solitude. The first night was quiet, too quiet. I sat by the fire, the flickering flames casting long shadows across the room. As I stared into the fire, I started to hear things. At first, it was just the wind, rustling the branches of the trees outside. But then, there was something else. A faint tapping noise, like something hitting the side of the cabin. I stood up, rifle in hand, and walked over to the window. I couldn't see anything. The night was dark, the trees thick, and the shadows deep. I told myself it was just the wind. It had to be. The tapping continued for a while before stopping, and eventually, I tried to shake it off and went to bed. The second night felt different. The silence in the cabin seemed more oppressive now. I'd been out hunting all day, spent hours tracking a deer through the forest, but didn't get a good shot. I'd made my way back to the cabin as the sun set, empty-handed but satisfied. The forest was beautiful in its own right, but the deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. There was something about it, something unsettling. A strange heaviness that seemed to press in on me, even though the forest itself was peaceful. That evening, as I sat down to eat a quick meal of canned stew, the tapping returned. Only this time it was louder, clearer, came from outside the cabin, just beneath the window. The rhythm was slow, deliberate, like something was trying to get my attention. I put down the spoon, rifle within reach, and made my way to the window. The wind had died down, and the world outside was still, the trees motionless. I saw nothing. I decided to take a walk around the cabin. With my rifle slung over my shoulder, I circled the building slowly, checking the perimeter. Nothing. No sign of anything. It was absurd, but I felt it. Something wasn't right. After a few minutes, I went back inside, locked the door, and stoked the fire. I had to shake off the feeling. I told myself I was just being paranoid. I hadn't been out here alone in years, and the isolation was starting to get to me. But I couldn't shake the feeling. Something about the tapping gnawed at me, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't normal. It didn't feel natural. The tapping escalated on the third night. Started the same way it had the night before, soft at first, but this time it didn't stop. It went on, getting louder, more insistent, until it was a steady thudding at the walls. I grabbed my rifle, heart pounding, and rushed outside. The night air was cold, sharp with the scent of pine, but the tapping didn't let up. It was coming from the forest. I moved cautiously toward the trees, scanning the darkness. The moon was high, casting pale light over the forest floor. And then I saw it, a figure moving between the trees. It was tall, too tall. It was hunched over, its limbs long and unnatural. My heart raced as I froze, rifle aimed in the figure's direction. My breath came in sharp gasps as I watched it move, like it was gliding between the trunks, its feet barely touching the ground. Suddenly, it stopped. It was looking right at me, its face hidden in the shadow of the trees. A feeling of dread washed over me, freezing me in place. I didn't know what to do. I had to make a decision, take the shot or run. But in that moment, the figure simply turned and disappeared into the forest. I stood there for a long while, rifle still raised. The forest had gone deathly silent. My heart was pounding in my chest, but there was no more tapping, no more movement. It was like the forest had swallowed up whatever I'd just seen. I finally made my way back to the cabin, locking the door behind me, but sleep didn't come easy that night. Every creak of wood, every rustle of leaves outside, made me jump. I had no idea what I'd just witnessed, but it felt wrong, like I was being watched. The next morning, I decided to leave. I had no reason to stay any longer. Whatever had been happening outside the cabin, it wasn't something I wanted to understand. I packed up my things quickly, my hands trembling as I stuffed my gear into the truck. I didn't even take the time to clean up the cabin. The rifle, now slung over my shoulder, felt heavy as I made my way down the front steps, my boots crunching on the gravel driveway. As I got in my truck and started the engine, I took one last look at the cabin. There was no sign of anything, no shadowy figures, no tapping on the walls, just the quiet forest. I wasn't sure what happened that night, but I knew one thing. Whatever it was, I didn't want to be around to find out. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, a break from the noise of the city, a chance to breathe the fresh air of the mountains, and to reconnect with nature. I had been working nonstop for weeks, so the idea of escaping to a small cabin seemed perfect. Just me, my truck, and the wild outdoors. It wasn't my first time camping alone, but it was the first time I'd been to this part of the forest. And as I turned off the main road onto the winding trail, the quiet and isolation started to sink in. The cabin was about a 2-hour drive north of where I lived, tucked deep in a section of forest that wasn't popular with hikers or tourists. I'd read about it on a camping website, and the reviews were glowing. Peaceful, secluded, and the perfect spot for someone looking to get away. A tiny little place, no electricity, no running water, just the essentials. I arrived in the early afternoon, around 3 p.m. The sunlight was still strong, but there was an edge to the air, cold even for early fall. The cabin itself was a small, one-room building with a slanted roof and a wood-burning stove outside. There were no other cabins around. The only sounds were the rustling of the wind through the trees and the occasional distant call of birds. I parked my truck and unloaded my gear, setting up for a couple of days of solitude. The cabin didn't look like much from the outside, but it had character. The wood was old, faded from years of weathering, but it was solid. The door creaked as I opened it, revealing a simple interior. A few pieces of old furniture, a bed, a table, and a small wood stove. A handful of firewood sat stacked neatly by the door, and there were some shelves filled with canned food and dry goods. It was the perfect setup for a peaceful retreat, the kind of place where you could sit, read, fish, and just forget about everything. By dusk, the light was fading quickly, so I lit the stove to warm up the cabin. There was something odd about the place, but I couldn't put my finger on it. It wasn't anything overt, just the feeling of being watched. It was subtle, almost like the way the forest seemed to grow quieter as night approached. The wind picked up, the trees swaying gently, casting long, strange shadows across the ground. I made a small fire outside in the fire pit, and as I sat by it, I noticed something in the distance, movement. At first, I thought it was just a deer or some other animal, but as I focused, I realized it was something on 2 legs. It was standing at the edge of the tree line, just beyond where the light from my fire reached. I squinted, but the figure didn't move. It was too far to make out any details, but I felt a chill run down my spine. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. It was probably another hiker or someone else staying in a cabin nearby. But something about the way it stood, motionless, didn't feel right. I stared at it for a few more minutes, but it didn't move. Eventually, I convinced myself to just go back inside and focus on the fire. That night, sleep didn't come easy. The cabin creaked and groaned in the wind, and every now and then, I'd hear the sound of something scraping against the outside walls. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a squirrel. But then I heard it again. The sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic, almost like something was walking around the cabin. I checked the door and windows to make sure everything was locked, then pulled the covers up to my chin and tried to sleep. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure again, standing at the edge of the forest, watching. When morning finally came, I felt exhausted. The sun was barely up, and there was a heavy fog in the air, making the trees look like dark, looming shapes. I had a small breakfast, gathered my gear, and decided to go for a hike to clear my head. I grabbed my knife just in case, but I wasn't expecting trouble. Still, the weird feeling from the night before stuck with me. I headed out toward the nearby creek, thinking I could catch some fish or just enjoy the peace of the water. The fog was thick, and I couldn't see very far ahead of me, but the trail was clear. I followed it for a while, the only sounds being my footsteps and the distant call of birds. As I walked deeper into the forest, I started to notice things. Small things that didn't seem right. There were broken branches scattered along the trail, as if something large had been pushing through the underbrush. The ground had strange, deep indentations in it, like something heavy had been walking through. I paused and knelt down to examine them, but whatever had made them was far bigger than any animal I'd ever seen. I stood up and took a deep breath, trying to push the unsettling thoughts out of my mind. I wasn't some paranoid city dweller. I'd been in the woods enough times to know that animals could make strange trails and sounds. But this felt different. I made my way back to the cabin, and the whole time I was walking, I felt like I was being followed. Every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves had my head snapping around, but I never saw anything. The forest seemed dead silent now, like it was holding its breath. I got back to the cabin and shut the door behind me, locking it for good measure. I wasn't sure what I was afraid of, but something didn't feel right. That evening, after another quiet day in the cabin, I decided to make a fire outside again. I needed something to take my mind off the tension that was building up inside me. The fire crackled to life, and I sat back in my camp chair, watching the flames dance. The wind had died down, and the forest seemed almost unnervingly still. No animals, no birds, just the fire. Then I heard it again, the sound of something moving in the trees. It was closer this time, just beyond the tree line like before. But this time it wasn't standing still. It was moving, walking in a slow, deliberate way, as though it were trying to be quiet, but failing. My heart started to race, and I stood up, scanning the darkness. There was no way an animal could move like that. No deer, no bear, no elk. Nothing moved like that. The sound was unmistakable now. Something or someone was out there, walking around the edge of the clearing. My eyes darted to the shadows between the trees, but I couldn't see anything. I took a step back toward the cabin, my mind racing. The figure I'd seen the day before flashed through my mind, and everything I'd dismissed as imagination was suddenly real. I grabbed my knife, not knowing what I expected to do with it. If it was an animal, I had no chance. If it was something else, I didn't even want to think about it. My breath was shallow, and the weight of fear pressed down on me, making everything feel heavier, slower. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear any movement, any sound. But there was nothing. It was like the forest itself had stopped breathing. Then I heard the door to the cabin creak. It was the faintest sound, but it was enough to make my heart jump into my throat. I spun around and saw something standing in the doorway. It wasn't an animal. The figure stood there, hunched, its back slightly arched, as if it were trying to make itself smaller. The shape was tall, too tall for any person I'd ever seen, and it was covered in what looked like ragged, matted fur. Its head was turned to the side, like it was trying to look at me, but I couldn't see its face. There was a horrible, unnatural stillness about it, like it was frozen in place. Without thinking, I sprinted toward the cabin, slamming the door shut behind me. I locked it, shoved the chair in front of it, and backed into the corner, watching the door. The sound of footsteps grew louder, circling the cabin now, dragging along the dirt and gravel. I didn't sleep that night. The footsteps never stopped. They circled the cabin, moved up to the roof, then down to the windows. Every now and then, I heard something scrape against the wood, like claws or nails, and I couldn't tell how long I'd been awake. Hours? Days? At some point, the sound stopped. The silence was so complete that I thought my ears were ringing. I waited and waited. Finally, the first light of morning began to filter through the small cracks in the cabin. It was over. The thing was gone. I didn't wait around. I packed up what little gear I had left, grabbed my things, and bolted out the door. I wasn't looking back. The forest felt like it had been holding its breath, and the air had a strange, oppressive quality. I made it to my truck and drove as fast as I could, not stopping until I was out of the woods and back on the main road. That was the last time I ever went back to those mountains. The night air was cold, biting at my skin as I stood in front of the old cabin. It wasn't much, just a wooden shack tucked away in a secluded patch of forest, but it had been my plan for the weekend. I needed to escape. The city had become a suffocating place. People everywhere, noise, traffic, deadlines. I was worn out. So when I found this place on an old travel website, I thought it would be perfect. A little cabin in the woods where I could clear my head, maybe catch up on some reading, and breathe. That's all I wanted. I parked my truck just off the dirt road, the tires crunching over the uneven ground. The trees were dense here, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands trying to pull me deeper into the forest. There were no neighbors, no sounds of civilization, just the wind and the occasional rustle of leaves. Perfect. Exactly what I needed. The cabin stood in front of me, nestled against the base of a hill, its wooden beams dark with age. It looked like something out of an old horror movie. Shabby, worn, and abandoned. But the listing online had said it was just renovated. It was supposed to be rustic yet modern, whatever that meant. I had my doubts now, but it was too late to back out. I was here. I grabbed my bag from the truck and made my way up the small path toward the cabin. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the hinges protesting against the weight. Inside, it smelled musty. Old wood, stale air, and something faintly metallic. The floors were rough, uneven, but the space was surprisingly clean. A small kitchen area to the left, an old wood stove against the far wall, a sofa, and a few mismatched chairs. There was no television, no Wi-Fi, not even a radio. But that was the idea, right? Total isolation. I set my bag down on the table and took a slow breath, trying to calm the nerves that were already creeping up on me. It was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're being watched. But I shook it off. I had spent a lot of time in the wilderness before, hiking, camping, so I knew the drill. Nature had a way of making you feel small and vulnerable, but you couldn't let it get to you. I checked out the rest of the cabin. There was a small bedroom at the back, a narrow bed with a plain white quilt. No real comfort, but it would do. The bathroom was even more basic, a tiny sink and a shower with a cracked tile floor. Nothing special, but again, I wasn't here for luxury. After unpacking, I decided to take a walk. It was late afternoon by now, the sun sinking lower in the sky. The air was still cold, the ground wet with the remnants of an old rainstorm. I grabbed my jacket and headed out the door. The dirt road curved around the cabin, leading into the forest. I wasn't far from the cabin when I noticed something strange. A small pile of rocks, carefully stacked, near the base of a tree. The rocks were rough, jagged, and unpolished, but they were arranged deliberately. Not the kind of thing you'd expect to see in the woods without some human hand involved. It struck me as odd, but not too odd. Maybe some hikers had passed through, leaving a mark, or maybe it was part of some old trail marker. I continued walking, trying to dismiss the thought. The sun was setting now, and I knew I had to head back to the cabin soon. As I made my way back, I noticed a few more piles of rocks, each one more intricate than the last, placed carefully around the trunks of trees. They formed odd shapes, patterns, almost like a trail. My stomach twisted. It wasn't just a few random rocks. Someone had placed them there on purpose, and they were leading me deeper into the forest. By the time I was back at the cabin, night had fallen. The cabin seemed more isolated than before, the windows black against the dark woods outside. I locked the door and sat down on the couch, trying to shake the unease from my mind. I wasn't a superstitious person, but something about those rocks unsettled me. The night dragged on in silence. I ate some snacks, read a little, then tried to sleep. But I couldn't. The quiet outside was suffocating. Every creak of the wood in the walls felt amplified. I found myself staring at the dark corners of the room, expecting to see something or someone moving in the shadows. By the time the clock hit 3 a.m., I was wide awake, staring at the ceiling. My mind kept returning to the rocks. What did they mean? Who had placed them? I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone here. I grabbed a flashlight and stood up, then froze. There was a faint sound outside the cabin, a soft rustling. Not the wind, not animals. It was human. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I moved to the window, peeking out through the blinds. I didn't see anything, but the flashlight beam bounced off something near the edge of the trees. My breath hitched. It looked like more rocks. But no, this was different. The pattern was unnatural, almost like a spiral. It was too precise, too deliberate. I couldn't help myself. I had to go see. Grabbing my jacket again, I stepped outside, feeling the cold air bite at my skin. The rustling sound had stopped, but the silence was almost worse. The flashlight in my hand shook as I moved toward the trees. The spiral of rocks was even more defined up close. I knelt down, running my fingers over the jagged edges. This was not a random pattern. Someone had arranged this with intent. But why? As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A figure just beyond the trees, standing motionless. It was too dark to make out any details, but I could see the outline of a person, just standing there, watching me. My heart pounded in my chest, and I turned, running back toward the cabin. I couldn't look back, but the feeling of being chased, of being hunted, filled my mind. I slammed the door behind me and locked it, gasping for air. My hands were trembling. I felt like I was going to be sick. The figure had been standing too still, too silent. I had to get out of there. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but the signal was gone. Of course, it was. Why had I thought I could rely on it out here? My mind raced. I couldn't stay. I needed to leave now. I quickly packed a bag with essentials: water, some food, my jacket, and rushed to the door. But before I could open it, I heard something. A low thud, followed by another, and another, like someone was knocking at the door. No, it wasn't knocking. It was banging, as if they were trying to break it down. I backed away, my heart racing. Whoever it was outside didn't seem to care about the door. They were getting closer. Another thud, louder this time. The door shuddered against the frame. I bolted for the back window and slid it open. The cold air rushed in as I crawled through, my hands scraping against the rough wood. I didn't look back as I ran into the forest. The darkness swallowed me whole. The moon barely pierced through the canopy of trees. The only sound was my breath, ragged and fast. I didn't know where I was going, just away. Away from the cabin, away from whatever was out there. But as I ran, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I wasn't alone in these woods. I tripped and fell, my hands cutting against the sharp rocks that jutted from the ground. I pushed myself up, ignoring the pain, and kept running. In the distance, I thought I saw something moving, darting between the trees, just out of the corner of my eye. I couldn't focus on it, couldn't stop. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I broke through the trees and found myself back at the dirt road. I collapsed, gasping for breath, my legs aching. The road was empty, but I didn't care. I stood up, shaky, and started walking toward my truck. By the time I reached it, the sun was starting to rise, painting the sky with soft pinks and oranges. It didn't feel like a new day. It felt like I was running away from something that wouldn't let me go. I started the engine, the sound of it roaring to life a welcome relief. I drove away from the cabin, my hands gripped tightly on the wheel. But even as I pulled further from that place, the feeling stayed with me. That feeling of being hunted, of being watched. I would never return. I've always loved the idea of getting away. The chaos of city life, the endless noise, the stress of work. It all made me feel like I was drowning. So when I got a week off in early October, I booked a cabin deep in the woods of the Lake District in the UK. It wasn't fancy, not by a long shot. Just a small, isolated place near the edge of a forest, far from any town or real civilization. I thought it would be peaceful, quiet, a chance to disconnect and clear my head. I needed it. I arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon, the sun already beginning to dip behind the trees. It was exactly what I expected. A modest, two-story structure with a stone chimney, a small porch, and a sagging roof. The kind of cabin you imagine when you think of rustic getaways. The trees surrounding it were dense, their leaves just starting to change color with the onset of autumn. The air was crisp, and the only sounds were the wind rustling through the branches and the distant call of birds. Inside, the place was basic. There was a wood-burning stove in the living room, a couch covered in faded fabric, and an old wooden table with mismatched chairs. It wasn't luxurious, but it felt comfortable. I unpacked my things, mostly books, a few changes of clothes, and some food, and set to work lighting the stove. As the fire crackled to life, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. I was alone, and for the first time in months, I didn't have to worry about anything. The first evening passed without incident. I cooked a simple meal, read a bit, and eventually went to bed. I fell asleep easily, lulled by the sound of the wind outside and the warmth of the fire. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning that things started to feel off. I woke up to the sound of a door creaking. I lay still in the darkness, straining my ears, but I couldn't tell where it was coming from. The wind or something else? The cabin was small, and all the doors and windows were closed. But the sound was unmistakable, and it felt too real to be the wind. I waited, heart pounding, listening. The air felt heavier now, colder, even though the stove was still burning. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something had changed. I decided to get up and check. I grabbed my flashlight from the bedside table, flicked it on, and stood up. The floor creaked under my feet as I moved toward the stairs. It was pitch dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the stove downstairs. I made my way down slowly, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness in front of me. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I stopped. There was no sound now, no creaking door, just silence. I stood there for a moment, wondering if I'd imagined it, but something still felt off. The house had a strange stillness to it, as if everything was holding its breath. I checked the doors locked, the windows shut tight. Nothing seemed out of place. I was about to head back to bed when I noticed something odd. The kitchen window, the one that looked out into the forest, was slightly ajar. I was sure I had closed it before going to bed, but there it was. Just a crack, not enough to let in a breeze, but enough to make me feel uneasy. I stepped closer, my breath shallow, and peered through the window. Outside, the darkness of the forest stretched out endlessly. I could barely make out the shadows of trees in the moonlight. For a moment, I thought I saw something moving between the trees, a flicker of white, but it was gone before I could focus on it. I couldn't explain it, but a cold shiver ran down my spine. I closed the window quickly and locked it, then backed away from it, my mind racing. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe I had just forgotten to shut the window properly. But why did it feel like something was watching me? I spent the rest of the night on edge, trying to sleep but unable to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I tried to push it out of my mind. I had a cup of tea and went for a walk to clear my head. The sun was out, and the forest looked beautiful in the daylight. I walked for hours down narrow paths, past streams, and through the woods. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional call of a bird. But as the day wore on, I started to notice something strange. The further I walked, the more I began to feel like I was being followed. Every time I stopped, I would hear something, a twig snapping, the rustling of leaves, just out of sight. I turned around several times, but each time there was nothing there. Still, the feeling didn't go away. By the time I made my way back to the cabin, the sun was beginning to set again. I was exhausted, mentally and physically, but I tried to shake off the unease that had settled over me. I cooked a simple dinner, but I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. The feeling of being watched hadn't left. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every noise seemed amplified in the stillness of the cabin, and I kept waking up, my mind racing. But nothing happened.
No doors cracked.
No windows were opened. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath. On the third day, I decided to leave the cabin. I figured a day trip to one of the nearby towns would help me clear my head. I packed a bag, locked up the house, and set off in my car. The drive was peaceful at first, but as I neared the edge of the forest, I felt it again. That strange sense of being watched. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild. I had been alone for too long. Maybe I was just starting to crack. But when I reached the town, things took another strange turn. I went into a small shop to grab some supplies, and as I was paying, the elderly woman at the counter gave me a long, appraising look. I felt a chill run through me as she stared, her eyes never leaving mine. She didn't say anything at first, just studied me like I was some kind of specimen. "Stay out of the woods, dear," she finally said, her voice low and steady. "There's something out there. You don't want to go looking for it." Her words hit me like a slap, and I left the shop quickly, my heart pounding. It wasn't just the warning, it was the way she said it, as though she knew something I didn't. I drove back to the cabin feeling more unsettled than ever. The sun was setting again by the time I arrived, and I locked the car and hurried inside, more determined than ever to stay inside for the rest of the evening. But the feeling of unease wouldn't leave me. It followed me through the house, clung to the walls, and settled into my bones. The stillness was deafening. As night fell, I sat in the living room, staring into the fire. The flames danced, casting long shadows on the walls, but all I could hear was the thudding of my own heart. I felt like I was being watched, and for the first time since I arrived, I regretted coming here. The cabin, which had once felt like a retreat, now felt like a trap. That's when I saw her. She was standing just outside the window, her pale face pressed against the glass. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks, but when I blinked, she was still there, staring at me with wide, hollow eyes. I froze. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Her hair was long, wild, and tangled, and her skin looked like it had never seen the sun. She was wearing a long, tattered dress, and her mouth hung open slightly, as if she were about to speak, but no sound came. I don't know how long I stood there, locked in place, but eventually, I managed to tear my eyes away from her and scramble to the door. I threw it open, my flashlight in hand, but when I stepped outside, there was no sign of her. No footprints in the dirt, no trace that anyone had been there. I searched the area, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but there was nothing. The woods were silent, too silent, and the moon cast long, eerie shadows across the ground. I went back inside, locking every door and window, convinced that I had just seen something that wasn't real. Maybe I was losing my mind, the isolation getting to me. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, and by morning, I was determined to leave. I packed up my things and drove out of the woods without looking back. I never did figure out who the woman was or why she was watching me, but something tells me I wasn't meant to know. Some things, I think, are better left unexplained. It's been years since I left that cabin, but I still get the occasional shiver when I think back to that night. I never went back to the Lake District. The memory of that woman, standing in the window, still haunts me. The woods have a way of making you feel small, insignificant, like you don't belong. And sometimes I wonder if I was just unlucky, or if I was never meant to leave at all. The wind howled through the trees outside, a mournful, biting sound that made the cabin creak in response. My dog, Jake, a scruffy, white and tan terrier mix, sat by the window, staring out into the blackness of the woods. I could see the reflection of his brown eyes in the glass, wide and alert, but I couldn't see what he was looking at. The darkness beyond the cabin was thick and oppressive, and there was nothing to break it except the occasional flicker of moonlight that managed to slip through the skeletal trees. It had been a quiet trip up to the old cabin, just me and Jake, out for a weekend to get away from everything. I wasn't exactly sure why I had picked this cabin. It was a cheap, rundown place, just a one-room shack tucked in the middle of a dense forest, far off the main roads. The kind of place you only find after hiking for miles on narrow trails. But I was tired of the city, tired of people, tired of the noise. I wanted peace. I thought I could find it here. The cabin was older than I had expected. The wood smelled of mildew and earth. The walls bowed slightly with age. The fire crackled lazily in the stone fireplace, and the dim light from the flames danced across the wooden beams of the ceiling. It was supposed to be comforting, but for some reason, a sense of unease kept creeping in. I had been alone for hours. I had unpacked my things, made a fire, and even managed to cook a simple meal for myself, though my stomach felt tight the whole time. It was just the silence. The forest was heavy with it, and it felt unnatural. There were no birds, no insects, not even the wind rustling through the branches like you might expect in the woods. Just silence, broken only by the occasional crack of the fire. Jake started to whine, low and soft. It wasn't his usual playful whine. It was different, like he was trying to warn me about something. I looked over at him. He wasn't looking at me. His attention was fixed on the dark window, his body tense, tail stiff. His ears were raised, and the fur along his back was standing up. I couldn't see anything outside. There was no movement, no sounds from the forest. "Jake," I whispered, even though I didn't think he could hear me. But I said it anyway, trying to calm myself more than him. I got up and walked over to the window, my boots creaking on the wooden floor. The glass was cold to the touch, but I leaned forward, squinting through the darkness. Nothing, but Jake wouldn't stop staring. His eyes flicked back and forth, scanning the trees, his breathing sharp and quick. I felt my heart rate increase, though I couldn't explain why. There was no sound outside, no reason to be afraid, but something about the way Jake was acting made my gut twist. I sat down next to him, trying to calm both of us. The fire crackled, and the wind outside picked up, rattling the windows. The noise was steady, almost comforting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The night dragged on like that, the unease building. I kept checking the time, but it seemed to stretch on forever. Jake eventually lay down, but his eyes never left the window. He would occasionally let out a low growl, his hackles raised. I tried to tell myself that it was just the wind, or some animal moving through the forest. But every time I glanced at Jake, his tense posture told me it was more than that. I decided to go to bed, figuring that maybe I was just overthinking things. The cabin had an old, creaky bed with a thin mattress, and I could feel every spring beneath me as I lay down. Jake, however, didn't get on the bed with me like he usually did. Instead, he stayed by the window, his eyes wide open and watching. The silence was almost suffocating now. I pulled the blankets up over me and closed my eyes, trying to ignore the pit in my stomach. Hours passed. I don't know how long exactly, but I woke up to the sound of Jake growling softly, a low, rumbling growl that shook his chest. I sat up in the bed, my heart racing. It was dark, pitch dark. I reached for the flashlight on the small table by the bed, my hands trembling as I flicked it on. The beam of light cut through the room, but it didn't feel reassuring. It made the shadows longer, more oppressive. I looked at Jake. His eyes glinted in the darkness, fixed on the door. Then I heard it, a faint sound, like something scraping against the cabin. I froze, listening. It was almost imperceptible, but it was there. A soft scraping, then a pause. Another scrape, this time louder. My breath caught in my throat. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I grabbed the flashlight and stood up, my knees weak. Jake was at my side now, tail low, still growling. I stepped cautiously to the door, the sound of my boots too loud in the silence. The cabin was old, and I knew that animals sometimes got into the walls. Mice, raccoons, maybe a squirrel. But the sound didn't feel like that. It felt deliberate. I opened the door a crack, the cold air rushing in, carrying with it the sharp scent of pine. I could hear the scrape again, this time unmistakable. Something was scratching at the wood. I swung the door open, shining the flashlight in the direction of the sound. There was nothing out there, nothing but trees and the endless dark. But Jake started to bark, loud and insistent, his hackles raised. The sound stopped. I scanned the dark forest. No movement, no sound except for the occasional rustling of the wind. My pulse thudded in my ears. I stepped outside, holding the flashlight in front of me like a weapon, my dog right behind me. The air was cold, biting, and my breath came out in white puffs, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I made my way around the cabin, looking for any sign of what could have made that noise. The ground was soft with old leaves and damp from the earlier rain. The trees towered over me like dark sentinels, their limbs swaying gently in the wind. But everything looked normal, too normal. And then, as I rounded the corner of the cabin, I saw it. A small, crude mark on the wood, scratches, deep and jagged, like something had tried to claw its way inside. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't just an animal. This was deliberate. Suddenly, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up again. Something wasn't right. I could feel it now, deep in my gut, a sense of being watched, being hunted. Without thinking, I turned to Jake and started back toward the door. I wasn't staying out here any longer. But as I reached for the door, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. Someone or something was out there. I had been hiking for hours when I found the cabin. It wasn't exactly a planned stop, just a random decision to take a detour off the main trail after a long stretch of empty woods. The path had been deserted for miles, no other hikers or even signs of animal life. Just me, the woods, and the biting cold that had settled in as the sun dipped behind thick clouds. It was late fall, and the temperature had already dropped to a point where I regretted not bringing a heavier jacket. I hadn't seen another soul since morning, and I had started to get that uneasy feeling, the kind that gnaws at the back of your brain when the isolation starts to feel too complete. It wasn't normal for a trail to be this empty. Even in the off-season, I'd expect to pass someone, a fellow hiker or a hunter, but there was nothing. The cabin appeared out of nowhere. One minute I was scanning the woods for the path, and the next I was standing on the edge of a small clearing with an old, weather-beaten structure in front of me. It looked abandoned, the kind of place you'd expect to see in a movie, where the floorboards creak and the windows are broken, only it was real. I didn't know why I was drawn to it, but maybe it was because the cold was biting so hard I thought I might freeze if I didn't find some shelter soon. The wind had picked up, whipping through the trees and sending a chill through my bones. The cabin, with its peeling paint and sagging roof, seemed like a refuge in comparison to the bitter wind outside. I pushed open the door, and it creaked loudly, the sound echoing across the clearing. Inside, the cabin smelled musty and damp, like it hadn't been touched in years. There was a fireplace on one wall, but it had long since gone cold. The floor was covered in dirt and leaves, and there were bits of broken furniture scattered around, like someone had just left in a hurry. I stepped inside cautiously, feeling a shiver run through me. There was something unsettling about the place, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was the fact that the air felt stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in a long time, or maybe it was the strange silence that hung in the cabin. No creaks of the woods settling, no distant sounds from the woods outside, just silence. I set my backpack down and checked my phone. No signal. I'd been out of range for a while, but it still felt unsettling. I'd have to wait until morning to get back to the trailhead. As I looked around, I started to notice more details. Scratches on the wooden walls, broken glass in the corners, what looked like the remains of an old fire pit in the middle of the floor. There was something off about it all. I tried to shake the feeling. I had a fire to start, and at least I could warm up. I rummaged through the cabin, finding old, dry wood by the back door. It was cold and hard, but I was able to gather enough to get a fire going in the hearth. As the flames crackled to life, I felt a bit more at ease. The light flickered and danced across the cabin, throwing strange shadows across the walls. I sat near the fire, pulling my jacket tighter around me. The wind howled outside, making the cabin creak and groan as if it were alive. I could see the edges of the roof sway in the wind, and I worried for a moment that the place might not be safe. But the fire was warm, and the shelter felt secure. I tried to relax, but something kept gnawing at the back of my mind. The longer I sat there, the more I began to feel like I was being watched. It wasn't a logical feeling. It wasn't like I heard footsteps or saw shadows move, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was off. I started to explore the cabin more thoroughly, just to take my mind off the unease. There was an old, faded calendar on the wall, the pages yellowed and curling at the edges. The last date on it was from 2013. The cabin had clearly been abandoned for a long time, but the calendar was the kind of thing you'd expect to update if you were still using the place. In the back corner, I found an old chest, its wood rotting but still intact. Curious, I pried it open, half expecting to find it full of old clothes or forgotten items. Instead, I found something much stranger. Inside, there were stacks of newspapers, all dated from the 1990s. They were carefully folded, like they had been placed there on purpose. I flipped through the yellowed pages, but nothing seemed particularly interesting. It was all old news, local stories about hunting accidents, missing hikers, and strange disappearances. As I dug deeper, something caught my eye, an article about a family that had gone missing in these very woods. It was a story I remembered hearing about back when I was younger. A mother, father, and their 2 children had disappeared without a trace. No bodies were ever found, and the case had gone cold. I couldn't help but feel uneasy as I stared at the photo of the family, their smiling faces frozen in time. There was something about the look in their eyes that made me shiver, like they knew something I didn't. I quickly slammed the chest shut and backed away. I started to feel like I needed to leave. I didn't know why, but the feeling of being watched had only grown stronger, and the fire didn't seem as comforting as it had before. I grabbed my backpack and made my way to the door, but as I reached for the handle, I stopped. I don't know why I froze. Maybe it was the sound of something scratching against the wood. Maybe it was the way the wind howled outside, making it sound like someone was standing just outside, waiting. But in that moment, I knew I couldn't leave. Not yet. I turned back, forcing myself to stay calm. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears as I made my way back to the fire. The cabin seemed smaller now, closing in around me. the air thick with an unsettling presence. As the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving around outside. I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see someone staring back at me from the darkness. But there was nothing, just the wind howling through the trees. I stayed up late, watching the fire burn low, my thoughts racing. The wind outside was deafening now, and I was starting to feel dizzy from the lack of sleep. I could hear the cabin creaking and groaning, and I swore I could hear something else too. A faint scratching sound coming from the walls. The fire had burned down to embers by the time I decided I needed to sleep. I moved my backpack over to the corner of the cabin, curled up under my jacket, and tried to close my eyes. The sounds of the wind, the creaking, and the occasional scratching kept me awake, but eventually, exhaustion overcame me. It wasn't until the middle of the night that I woke up. The scratching sound was louder now, closer, like it was coming from just outside the cabin. I sat up, heart pounding in my chest, and tried to make sense of the noise. It wasn't the wind, it was too rhythmic, like something was trying to get in. I grabbed my flashlight and crept toward the door, my mind racing. The cabin was silent now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there. I shone the flashlight through the crack in the door, but there was nothing. Then I heard it, a thud, faint but unmistakable. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I grabbed my things and bolted from the cabin, not looking back until I was safely on the trail. I don't know what happened in that cabin. I don't know if anyone had ever lived there or if it was just a forgotten place. But I do know one thing for sure. Whatever was out there, whatever made that noise, wasn't something I ever wanted to find out about. The hike back to civilization felt like the longest of my life, but I made it. The wind, the isolation, and the dark, hollow silence of that cabin had all been too much. I never went back. I don't think I ever will. It was the quiet before the storm. Not a literal storm, though the weather was grim, as it usually was in these parts, but something deeper. The kind of silence that gnaws at your skin, making every snap of a twig or rustle of the wind feel like an omen. I've been out in these woods before, but something about this place, this cabin, felt different. I remember the first time I saw it. I had been driving for hours, winding my way through a series of narrow, winding roads that ran through the middle of nowhere. I wasn't really headed anywhere specific. It was late fall, and the trees had turned, their leaves now piled along the sides of the road like the remnants of something long forgotten. The smell of damp wood and earth filled the air. It was on a stretch of road that I had never driven before when I saw the cabin. From the distance, it seemed like an ordinary, rundown shack. Not unusual by any means, considering how many old places littered the landscape. But there was something off about it. The windows, for one, were completely shattered, with jagged glass still hanging in fragments, like teeth left behind from a violent bite. I needed a place to crash for the night, and it seemed as good as any, so I pulled off the road. The fact that the place was so secluded made me a little uneasy, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. The world had always seemed smaller when you're alone in it. I had never actually considered staying in the cabin until I saw it. The heavy, dark windows staring at me like cold, dead eyes. There was something inviting about it, but also something desperate. I felt an odd urge to investigate it, to figure out if this place was even habitable. It wasn't far off the road, nestled in a small grove of trees, half hidden from sight. Could have been abandoned for years or maybe even decades. I parked my truck and stepped outside, the air crisp and sharp as it bit into my skin. I gathered my bag, the one I always kept packed with essentials: water, a flashlight, a first aid kit, and approached the cabin slowly. The old wood creaked underfoot, and a faint smell of mildew hit me as I got closer. The door was half open, a rusty doorknob hanging crookedly. There was something about it that didn't sit right. I hesitated, my hand on the doorframe, but I was too tired to care. I pushed it open with a groan. The interior was dark, lit only by the pale light coming through the shattered windows. Dust motes floated in the air, and the floor was covered in a layer of old leaves and dirt. Broken furniture was scattered about. An old chair with its stuffing hanging out, a cracked coffee table, and a couch that had seen better days. I stepped inside, and the door swung shut behind me with an eerie thud. The temperature inside was cold, but not unbearable. I tossed my bag onto the couch and decided to explore the place, searching for anything useful. The main room was small, no more than a living room and kitchen area combined. There was a narrow hallway that led deeper into the cabin, but the light from the windows only reached so far. I decided to check out the hallway. The air smelled damp, the walls covered in peeling paint. At the end of the hall was a door, slightly ajar. It led to what I assumed was a bedroom, but before I could open it fully, a strange noise stopped me, like something scraping against the floor. I froze. The sound didn't make sense. It was too deliberate, too unnatural. For a moment, I told myself it was the wind. It had to be. I turned the knob slowly and pushed the door open with caution. Inside, the bedroom was in worse shape than the rest of the cabin. The bed was broken, the mattress a moldy mess on the floor, and a large, cracked mirror hung crookedly on the wall. In the corner of the room, next to the bed, was a small wooden box, oddly out of place amidst the decay. Couldn't resist. My curiosity got the better of me. I moved over to it and knelt down, brushing off the dust. The box was locked, but the key was hanging on a string, placed on top of the box as if inviting me to open it. With trembling fingers, I turned the key. Inside was a pile of papers, yellowed with age, and a small, jagged shard of glass. The shard was strange, its edges so sharp it looked like it could cut through anything. I picked it up, feeling the cold, hard surface in my hand. The papers were old, some torn, some barely legible. But the ones I could make out mentioned something about the previous owners. A couple who had lived here years ago. They had disappeared, leaving everything behind. No one ever found them. The glass shard seemed to have some significance, though it was unclear from the notes. I shoved the papers back in the box and stood up, the shard still in my hand. Something about it didn't sit right with me. I turned to leave the room when I noticed something strange in the mirror. The reflection didn't seem to match the room. For a second, I thought I saw movement, but when I looked again, it was just my own reflection staring back at me. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I left the bedroom quickly, my heart beating faster. I stood in the main room for a while, unsure of what to do next. I had the shard in my hand, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I checked the windows again, still shattered, still letting in the cold. I needed a fire, something to calm my nerves. So I set about gathering kindling and some old logs I found stacked outside. The fire was small but enough to keep the chill away. I settled into the old couch, watching the flames dance and crackle. My eyes kept drifting back to the shard of glass in my hand. There was something unsettling about it, but I couldn't explain why. The feeling of being watched didn't go away. As the night wore on, I began to feel the weight of the silence pressing in on me. The fire sputtered, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Every little sound seemed amplified: the wind outside, the creak of the wood, the crackle of the fire. And then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of something or someone scratching at the door. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The scratching was slow at first, almost rhythmic, and then it stopped. Dead silence followed. I sat there, tense and wide-eyed. Should I leave? Should I check it out? My mind was racing, but my body didn't want to move. Slowly, carefully, I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and moved toward the door. My hand was shaking as I reached for the handle, the shard of glass still gripped in my other hand. I hesitated. Should I open it? What if it was some animal or worse, someone playing a trick? I opened the door just a crack, enough to peer outside. The wind howled in, but there was nothing. Just the empty night and the sound of the trees swaying. Relief washed over me, but it didn't last long. I slammed the door shut and locked it. For a while, I just sat there in the dark, clutching the shard of glass. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every creak of the building made my heart race. Every gust of wind sent a chill down my spine. Something wasn't right. This place wasn't just abandoned. It was wrong. By morning, I had made my decision. I wasn't going to stay another night. I packed my things, the shard of glass still in my hand. The truck was still parked outside, but as I stepped out onto the porch, I noticed something strange. The cabin seemed different, almost as if it had shifted overnight. Felt colder. The air was heavier, like the world had been holding its breath. I didn't waste any more time. I drove off without looking back, the cabin growing smaller in my rearview mirror. Whatever had happened there, I knew I wasn't meant to be part of it. Later, I found out that the cabin had been abandoned for years, but that wasn't the strange part. The strange part was that, after I left, no one could find it again. It had simply disappeared. But that's a story for someone else. As for me, I never went back to those woods. Not once. Some things are better left unexplored. It was the middle of October, and I had just turned 29. The kind of birthday you don't really care about anymore. No big celebration, no fancy dinner, just the need for a break. My mind had been clogged with work, city noise, and constant distractions. A friend of mine, Dave, had mentioned a small cabin tucked away in the woods for a long time, and I decided this was the perfect moment to go. I didn't expect much, just a quiet place to unwind, away from everything. The cabin was in the mountains, not far from the small town of Greystone, a dot on the map that barely even had a gas station. I took my truck up through a maze of dirt roads and a few hours into the mountains, where the trees grew so thick they nearly blocked the sky. The air was sharp and crisp. My breath came out in little clouds as I carried my bag up to the cabin. The place looked exactly as described. A small wooden structure with a sloping roof, surrounded by trees, a creek running nearby. It was the kind of place you'd find in an old hiking magazine, one of those places people go to escape the noise of the world. There was no one else around, just miles of woods and a handful of dirt paths leading deeper into the forest. The sun was setting as I stepped inside. The cabin smelled of old wood and something slightly musty, but in a way that felt comforting. A few pieces of mismatched furniture were scattered around, and the stone fireplace sat silent and empty, waiting for a fire. I set my bag down, made sure everything was locked, and decided I would go out for a little walk before it got dark. I didn't want to be caught in the dark, not in a place like this. The woods were quiet, unnervingly so. It felt almost like the kind of place where sound was swallowed up. I walked down to the creek, where the water was clear and cold, rushing over rocks and through the trees. The air had that earthy scent, damp and raw. I felt a little better as I sat by the water for a while, but the calm didn't last long. As the sun dipped lower, the temperature dropped quickly. I made my way back to the cabin, starting to feel the weight of isolation pressing on me. I didn't think about it much earlier, but now I realized how far away I was from any kind of civilization. If something went wrong, there was no one nearby to help. I started a fire in the fireplace, the wood crackling and popping as the flames grew. I sat there, staring into the fire, lost in my thoughts, until the wind picked up. It wasn't anything severe, but the sound of the wind in the trees outside made the cabin feel less welcoming. The night had grown dark, and every so often, a gust would make the cabin creak, like it was complaining. Around 10 p.m., I noticed something strange, a sound. It was faint at first, but it was enough to pull me out of my daze. A tap, 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 almost like something lightly hitting the side of the cabin. I froze, listening. The tapping was intermittent, random, not a rhythmic knock, but more of a soft, irregular tapping. It wasn't like something falling, but almost like something gently rapping against the wood. I stood up and walked to the window. Nothing, just the dark woods, the silhouette of the trees swaying in the wind. I opened the door and stepped outside, the cool night air hitting my skin like a slap. My flashlight swept across the ground, looking for anything out of place. But there was nothing, no signs of animals or anyone else. I figured it was the wind or something like that, the kind of noise you can't explain when you're out in the middle of nowhere. So I locked up and went back inside, but the tapping started again. It came from the side of the cabin closest to the trees, just out of sight. It was softer this time, but still there. I grabbed the flashlight and went out again, heart starting to pound in my chest. I didn't know what to expect. Maybe an animal was messing with the walls, though that didn't quite seem right. I circled the cabin, shining the beam of light into the shadows, the beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. Nothing. I checked the shed. Nothing. The woodpile. Empty. Then I heard it again, this time louder. Came from the back of the cabin. I stood frozen for a moment. My mind was racing, but I couldn't make sense of it. My phone didn't have signal out here, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. I debated whether I should get in the truck and drive off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't something to run from. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I took a deep breath and went back inside. As I sat on the couch trying to calm myself, the tapping stopped. But it didn't feel like the night was over. Something was off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the cabin didn't feel like it had when I first arrived. It felt wrong, like I was being watched. The kind of feeling you get when you know you're alone, but every part of you is screaming that you're not. I decided to check the locks one more time, making sure everything was secure. That's when I noticed it, the smallest thing, but it made my stomach twist. The back door, the one I had locked earlier, was slightly ajar. I hadn't left it open. My heart dropped into my stomach as I slowly approached the door. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows against the walls. I leaned over and pushed it shut with one hand, locking it again. My breath was coming quicker now. I couldn't tell if the creeping sense of dread was something I was imagining or if something was really wrong. I stayed up late, too tense to sleep, too uneasy to even let my mind wander. The wind continued to howl outside, and every now and then, I'd hear the trees cracking, branches swaying. But it was the silence after each gust that unsettled me most, like the woods were holding their breath. At some point, exhaustion caught up to me. I fell asleep on the couch, the fire long since burned out. I don't know how long I was asleep, but I woke up with a start, sitting up so suddenly that it knocked the blanket off. My heart was racing again. Something had changed. I couldn't explain it, but the air in the cabin felt heavier, suffocating. I felt like I wasn't alone anymore. I quickly checked the windows, the door. Everything was still locked, but the feeling didn't go away. I had to leave. I grabbed my things, stuffed them into my bag, and practically ran to the truck. I didn't care if I left anything behind. I just had to get out of there. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. The headlights cut through the trees, illuminating the narrow, winding road back to the main highway. The further I drove, the more the tension in my chest eased, like a weight was finally lifting off me. I made it back to Greystone before dawn. The town was still asleep, the streets empty except for a couple of stray dogs wandering around. I found a small diner and sat there, trying to collect my thoughts. I ordered coffee, then another. The waitress gave me an odd look, probably wondering why I looked like I'd just seen a ghost. But I wasn't sure if I had or not. I couldn't explain the tapping. I couldn't explain the feeling of being watched, or how the door had been open when I knew I'd locked it. All I knew was that something had happened out there, something I couldn't put into words. Maybe it was just the isolation getting to me, but it didn't feel like that. The cabin was supposed to be a retreat, a quiet place to get away, but it became something else entirely. I never went back. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, a break from the constant grind of city life. No distractions, no emails, no work calls. Just peace, quiet, and a little solitude. I hadn't been to the cabin in years, not since my parents had passed away. They'd left it to me, but I hadn't felt the urge to visit until now. It was early October, the air already crisp and filled with that unmistakable smell of fall, damp earth, decaying leaves, and the sharp scent of pine. The trees stood in all their glory, wearing hues of red, orange, and yellow. I loaded up my truck with supplies. Food, a few cans of beer, a couple of bottles of whiskey I'd picked up on a whim, a hunting rifle, and a camping kit. The plan was simple. 2 days, 1 night. I'd get there, spend the night, and leave early the next morning. Quick retreat. I hadn't even told anyone where I was going. I wasn't looking for company. It was a place I could finally breathe, not having to worry about the constant noise of the city. The drive up was uneventful, just a long stretch of rural highway leading to a small back road. The sun had already begun to set as I reached the turnoff, and by the time I pulled into the small clearing near the cabin, it was nearly dark. The place looked exactly the same as I remembered: rough-hewn logs, a small stone chimney, and a porch with a couple of rocking chairs. It was secluded, a good 20-minute drive from the nearest neighbor, and that's what made it so appealing. The silence was perfect. I grabbed my gear, walked up the porch steps, and pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, a sound I had almost forgotten. Inside, the familiar smell of old wood and dust hit me. The cabin was basic, with a few mismatched chairs, a wooden table, a couch, and an old wood stove. The kitchen had a small stove and refrigerator, and upstairs there was a single bedroom with a large window overlooking the forest. I tossed my bags on the couch and set to work, getting the fire going. The light from the flames flickered across the room, casting long shadows against the walls. The first few hours were spent in peaceful solitude. I ate a small dinner, nothing fancy, just some canned beans and cold cuts. I opened a beer, kicked my feet up, and stared into the fire. I thought about how much I needed this. There was a certain comfort in the quiet, in the stillness of the cabin. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but inside it was warm and dry. As the night deepened, I felt the weight of the silence pressing in. It was strange, really, how quickly it could feel overwhelming. The darkness outside seemed to stretch farther and farther, and the shadows in the cabin began to shift unnervingly. I shook off the feeling, though. It was probably just the isolation. I poured myself a glass of whiskey, took a slow sip, and felt the warmth spread through me. I didn't sleep well that night. The cabin wasn't noisy, but I kept hearing things. The occasional thud from upstairs, a creak from the porch. Once, I could have sworn I heard footsteps in the woods. Slow, deliberate, like someone was walking just outside the tree line. I grabbed my rifle from the corner, but by the time I stepped outside, there was nothing, just the wind. I stood there for a few minutes, scanning the trees. Nothing, no movement, no sign of anyone. I shrugged it off. It was probably just my mind playing tricks on me. The next morning, I decided to go for a walk. I needed to clear my head. The air was cool and fresh, the scent of pine heavy in the atmosphere. I grabbed my rifle and set off down the small trail that led into the woods behind the cabin. The forest here was thick, dense, old trees that had been around for decades, maybe centuries. The ground was soft, covered in a thick layer of leaves, and the silence was absolute. Not even birds chirped this early. I walked for what felt like hours, the forest closing in on me, the sun barely peeking through the canopy. I had no particular destination in mind, just wandering, trying to clear my thoughts. Eventually, I came across a small creek, its water running clear over rocks, the sound of it soothing in the otherwise still woods. I knelt down to drink, cupping my hands in the cold water, and for a moment, I felt at peace. Then I saw it, the first sign that something was wrong. A figure. It was a man, maybe 30 yards away, standing in the shadows of the trees. At first, I thought it was just another hiker or someone passing through. But then I realized something wasn't right. The way he stood there, motionless, didn't feel normal. I froze, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. He was watching me. I could feel his eyes on me, even from that distance. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just stared back at him, trying to figure out if I had seen him before, if he was someone I knew. But he didn't make a move, didn't even seem to blink. His stillness was unnatural. The longer I stared, the more I felt a sense of dread creeping over me. Then, without warning, he turned and disappeared into the woods. I stood there for a long moment, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. My mind raced. Who was that? Why was he out here? I scanned the area, my rifle in my hands now, but there was no sign of him. Just the woods, dark and silent. I took a deep breath and shook my head. Maybe it was just someone hunting, maybe a local who knew these woods better than I did. Still, the encounter left me uneasy. I made my way back to the cabin quickly, almost in a jog. When I got inside, I locked the door behind me and sat down at the table, staring out the window, my mind racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone was watching me. I tried to push the thoughts from my mind and settled in for the rest of the afternoon. It wasn't until nightfall that things started to take a darker turn. I was sitting by the fire, drinking another whiskey, when I heard the sound of footsteps outside. Slow, steady, like someone was circling the cabin. My blood ran cold. I stood, grabbed the rifle, and crept toward the door. My mind raced. Who could it be? That man from earlier? Maybe someone else? The footsteps grew louder, closer. I couldn't see anyone through the small windows. I held my breath, listening, and then bang, the sound of something slamming into the door. Hard. My heart leapt in my chest. I swung the door open, rifle in hand, ready for whatever might come next. The porch was empty. I stepped outside cautiously, scanning the area. The wind was picking up, the trees swaying in the gusts. I could hear my own breathing, sharp and quick. I turned in a slow circle, checking the shadows of the trees. Nothing. The clearing around the cabin was empty, just the wind rattling the branches. But something was wrong. I could feel it deep in my gut. The hairs on my neck stood up again. I wasn't alone. I went back inside, bolted the door shut, and set the rifle down. I didn't know what to do. My mind kept racing, trying to piece together what was happening. The strange man in the woods, the footsteps, the sound at the door, but then a knock, soft, almost like a tap, but there, coming from the back window. I moved quietly, crouching down beside the window. I could see nothing out there in the darkness, just the trees, the shadows stretching long and twisted by the moonlight. I waited and waited, but the knock didn't come again. The night stretched on, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted, that someone was out there, circling, waiting for the right moment to strike. The quiet was unbearable. Each sound of the wind, each rustle of leaves, seemed to echo in my mind. I didn't sleep that night. The morning light came slowly, casting pale rays over the forest, but it didn't bring the comfort I had hoped for. I wasn't sure if I should stay or leave, but deep down, I knew it wasn't safe here anymore. I packed up my things quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. As I stepped outside, I noticed something strange near the edge of the clearing. It was a footprint, fresh, a boot print deep in the soft earth, and next to it, a patch of disturbed leaves, as though someone had been crouching there, watching. I didn't wait to find out who. I grabbed my gear, jumped in the truck, and sped down the winding road. I didn't look back as I left the woods behind. When I reached the main highway, I finally let out a long breath. I was safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever happened out there, whatever I had felt, wasn't just in my head. It wasn't until I got back home and spoke to the sheriff that the pieces began to fall into place. He told me there had been a string of break-ins in the area, and the description of the man I saw matched a local who had gone missing a few days earlier. But what really chilled me was when he mentioned a nearby property. The owner had been found dead in his cabin, his throat slit. The case was still under investigation. I never went back to that cabin. I didn't need to. I had seen enough to know that sometimes the silence in the woods isn't just peace. It's a warning. I never wanted to spend the night there. The cabin stood at the edge of an old graveyard, half buried in overgrown weeds, its walls weathered by time and rain. The wood was dark with rot in places, the nails rusted, the windows covered in a layer of grime so thick that the light barely passed through. I had driven past it many times on the narrow road that cut through the hills, but I had never paid it much attention until I needed a place to stay. It started with the storm. I had been driving through a rural stretch of countryside, trying to reach a friend's house before dark. The rain came in fast, a thick sheet that blurred the road, my wipers barely keeping up. The asphalt became slick, the tires struggling for grip as the wind howled through the trees lining the road. Then, just as I rounded a bend, my headlights flickered, the dashboard lights dimming. The car sputtered. I barely had time to react before the engine died completely. I coasted to a stop, cursing under my breath. Outside, the storm raged. The wind rocked the car, the rain hammering against the roof. I reached for my phone, but the signal was gone. I tried restarting the engine. Nothing, just the hollow click of a dead battery. I sat there, gripping the wheel, thinking through my options. The road was empty. No houses nearby, no traffic. The last town had been miles back, and walking in this storm wasn't an option. Then, through the rain-streaked windshield, I saw it. The cabin. It stood just beyond the graveyard's rusted fence, barely visible in the darkness. The place looked abandoned, but it was shelter, at least. I could wait out the storm and figure things out in the morning. I grabbed my bag, pulled my hood up, and stepped out into the downpour. The wind cut through my jacket immediately, the cold soaking into my bones. The ground was soft and uneven, mud grabbing at my boots as I climbed over the sagging fence and into the graveyard. The headstones were old. Some leaned at awkward angles, others had crumbled completely, their names long since worn away by time and rain. The air smelled of wet earth and decay. I walked carefully, avoiding the sunken ground, the storm making every step treacherous. The cabin door was unlocked. The wood groaned as I pushed it open, the hinges protesting. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of damp wood and dust. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a single-room interior. There was a cot against the far wall, the mattress thin and sagging. A table sat beneath the only window, a wooden chair beside it. Shelves lined one side of the room, mostly empty except for a few rusted tools and a stack of yellowed papers. In the corner, An old cast iron stove stood cold and lifeless. I shut the door behind me. The wind howled against the walls, the rain drumming on the roof. I set my bag down, brushing the wet hair from my face. The place was abandoned, that much was clear. Dust clung to every surface, and the air had the weight of a room that hadn't been lived in for years. But it was dry, and for now, that was enough. I tried my phone again, still no signal. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to relax. I'd seen worse places. At least this one had 4 walls and a roof. I sat down on the cot, feeling the old wood creak beneath me. I would wait for daylight, then walk back to the main road and flag someone down. It was just one night, but the longer I sat there, the more I noticed the sounds. The wind outside was fierce, but inside, beneath it, there was something else. A faint, almost rhythmic creaking, like footsteps on old wood. I held my breath. It was probably just the storm shifting the building, but my pulse quickened anyway. I listened, straining against the wind's roar. The sound came again, a slow, deliberate movement. It wasn't inside the cabin. It was coming from outside. I stood, my breath shallow. My flashlight beam swept across the walls, over the table, the shelves, the empty doorway leading to the porch. The storm had turned the window into a sheet of black glass, the rain distorting everything outside. Then the sound stopped. The wind carried on, rattling the walls, but the footsteps, if that's what they were gone. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just my nerves playing tricks on me. I'd been in enough isolated places to know how easily the mind could twist sounds into something else. I sat back down, rubbing my hands together for warmth. Then, just as I was starting to convince myself it was nothing, there was a knock, not a loud one, just a soft, deliberate tap against the wood. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe someone else had taken shelter here. Maybe they'd seen my car break down and followed me. But something was wrong. No one should have been out in this storm. No one should have known I was here. The knock came again. 3 slow taps against the door. My flashlight shook in my grip. I stood, my legs tense, every muscle in my body screaming for me to run. But where? Into the graveyard? Into the dark? Then, as suddenly as it had come, the knocking stopped. I waited. The wind howled. The rain lashed against the roof. But nothing else happened. I forced myself to take a breath, then another. Maybe it had been a tree branch. Maybe it was the wind shifting the wood. I told myself anything to keep from panicking. I sat back down. Minutes passed, then an hour. The wind died down slightly, the rain becoming a steady drizzle. My exhaustion caught up with me, the warmth of the cabin, thin as it was, making my eyelids heavy. I let my body relax, just for a moment. I don't know when I fell asleep. I woke up to silence. No wind.
No rain.
Just the heavy stillness of early dawn. For a moment, I didn't move. Then I remembered. The knocking. My pulse kicked up, my skin prickling. I turned my head slowly toward the door. It was open, not wide, just an inch. But I knew, without a doubt, that I had locked it. I stood, my breath sharp in my throat. My flashlight was still in my hand, but when I flicked it on, the batteries were dead. I reached for my bag. My knife was still there. I gripped it tightly, my knuckles white. I moved toward the door. Outside, the graveyard was still. Mist clung to the ground, the headstones jutting from the earth like jagged teeth. My car was where I had left it, the road stretching empty in both directions. But in the mud just outside the door, footprints. Deep, clear prints leading to the porch. But no prints leading away. My stomach turned. I stepped back into the cabin, slamming the door shut, locking it, shoving the table against it for good measure. Then I waited. Minutes passed, then hours. When the sun finally rose, I forced myself outside. I ran to my car, my heart pounding, yanking the door open, praying for a miracle. The engine turned over. I didn't question it. I just drove. I never looked back. I never told anyone. But I never forgot. And I never drove that road again. It was late October when I found the cabin. I had been driving through the back roads of the Peak District in England, looking for a quiet place to stay for the weekend. Life in Manchester had been wearing me down, the constant noise, the crowds, the stress of work. I needed a break, some silence, somewhere I could hear myself think. I hadn't booked a hotel or planned anything, just packed my bags and set off with the idea that I would find somewhere along the way. The sun had already started to dip behind the rolling hills when I spotted the cabin. It wasn't marked on my GPS, and I hadn't seen any signs for it on the main road. It sat back from the road, almost hidden by the dense woodland surrounding it. There was a small gravel path leading up to it, the kind that looked like it hadn't been used in a while. The structure itself was old, built from dark, weathered wood with a single window facing the road. I pulled over and sat in my car for a while, just looking at it. The place had an odd feeling about it, not quite abandoned, but not exactly inviting either. There were no cars outside, no signs of life, but there was a sign nailed to the fence post near the entrance, one of those hand-painted wooden signs that looked like it had been there for years. It read, "Vacancy. Inquire within." There was no phone number, no details, just that. I should have kept driving. Any reasonable person would have. But something about the place intrigued me. Maybe it was the way it seemed untouched, like it had been forgotten by time. Or maybe it was just desperation. I was tired, and the thought of driving around in the dark looking for a hotel didn't appeal to me. I stepped out of the car, stretched my legs, and made my way up the path. The wooden steps creaked under my weight as I stepped onto the porch. There was an old brass bell hanging beside the door. I reached out and rang it. Nothing happened. I waited, listening to the wind move through the trees. It was getting colder. The sun was nearly gone now, and the sky had turned that deep shade of blue that comes just before total darkness. I was about to turn back to my car when I heard it. The sound of a door unlocking from inside. The door opened slightly, not all the way, just enough to see inside. A warm light spilled out onto the porch, and for a moment, I felt stupid for being so uneasy. There was no one standing at the door. I stepped closer, peering into the cabin. It was simple but well kept. A wooden counter near the entrance, a small seating area with 2 chairs and a fireplace. There was a narrow hallway leading further back, but from where I stood, I couldn't see much else. "Hello," I called out. No answer. I stepped inside, glancing around. The air smelled like wood smoke and something else, something faintly metallic. I waited another moment, expecting someone to appear. When no one did, I took a step further in. There was a small bell on the counter, one of those old-fashioned service bells. I tapped it. Still nothing. I should have left right then, but I didn't. I walked around the room, running my fingers over the old wooden surfaces. The place was eerily silent, save for the occasional pop and crackle from the fireplace. There was no phone, no sign-in book, no indication that this was a place for visitors at all. Then I noticed something. The window, the same one I had seen from the road. From the outside, it had looked perfectly normal. But now, standing inside, I realized something was off. The glass was clouded, old, but I could still make out a faint reflection. And in that reflection, I saw her, a woman. She was standing just outside, staring in. Her face was pale, almost too pale, like she hadn't seen sunlight in years. Her dark eyes were fixed on me, unblinking. Her hair hung in damp strands around her face, and she was wearing a dress that looked old, tattered at the edges. I spun around. There was no one there. I turned back to the window, my pulse hammering in my ears. She was gone. The trees beyond the cabin swayed in the wind, their branches shifting and moving, but there was no sign of the woman. No footprints, no rustling leaves. Nothing. I stood there, breathing heavily, trying to convince myself that my mind was playing tricks on me. The long drive, the dim light, it had to be my imagination. I backed away from the window and turned toward the door. That's when I heard it. A creaking sound, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway behind me. I didn't turn around. Couldn't. Every hair on my body stood on end. I felt that deep, primal fear that tells you when something isn't right. I forced myself to move, to step toward the door. My hand was on the knob when I heard another sound. A whisper-soft shuffle, like bare feet moving across wooden floors. I yanked the door open and stepped outside, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but I barely noticed. I hurried down the steps, half expecting to feel a hand on my back at any moment. When I reached my car, I threw open the door and got in, locking it behind me. My hands were shaking as I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and my headlights lit up the cabin. And that's when I saw her again, standing at the window. She wasn't looking at me this time. She was looking at something inside the cabin, something behind where I had been standing just moments ago. I didn't wait to see what it was. I hit the accelerator and tore down the road, gravel flying beneath my tires. I didn't stop, didn't look back, not even when I reached the main road. I kept driving until I reached a small town about 20 miles away. I checked into the first hotel I found and locked my door behind me. That night, I barely slept. The next morning, I went to a small cafe and asked the owner about the cabin. He gave me a strange look. "There's no cabin out there," he said. "Not anymore. It burned down years ago." I didn't argue. I didn't tell him what I had seen. I just finished my coffee, got in my car, and drove home. I never went back. It started with the rain, the kind that turns roads into streams, soaks through your clothes before you even realize it's falling that hard. The kind that makes you feel alone, even when you aren't. I was driving up into the hills, my truck's tires sliding a little on the mud-slick gravel road, wipers fighting to keep the windshield clear. I didn't know then that I'd be fighting to get out of those woods alive by the next morning. The plan was simple: get to the cabin, spend the weekend cutting some firewood, maybe drink a little, sit in front of the stove, and pretend I didn't have to go back to the city on Monday. It was my uncle's place, but I had the key. He hardly used it anymore, just let it sit there collecting dust in the woods. It was small, one room, no electricity, just a propane stove and an old lantern. No one bothered you out here. That was the whole point. I should have noticed the signs. The first one was the fresh tire tracks in the mud, heading up the same road I was on. I figured it was just hunters, maybe someone checking on their own cabin. But then there was the second sign. The gate to the property, normally locked, was hanging open. I pulled up slow, rolling through the ruts, my headlights catching the rain bouncing off the ground. The cabin sat just ahead, dark, the front porch sagging a little more than the last time I was here. I turned off the engine, stepped out into the wet night. The forest was quiet, except for the rain ticking against the trees. That's when I saw the footprints, fresh, deep in the mud. More than one set. Somebody had been here recently, maybe still was. My stomach tightened. I wasn't armed, never had a reason to be up here. Just me and a hatchet in the back of the truck for splitting wood. I stepped up onto the porch, boots heavy on the damp planks. The door was unlocked. That was the third sign. I had locked it the last time I left. I pushed it open slowly, heart thudding. The smell hit me first. Something stale, like sweat, mixed with wet wood. My flashlight beam swept the room. The cot was unmade. The old table pushed aside like someone had bumped into it. But it was the duffel bag in the corner that stopped me cold. That wasn't mine. I didn't move at first, just listened. Rain on the roof. A branch creaking outside. My own breathing. Then something else. A shuffle, a shift of weight. Someone was inside. I backed up, stepping off the porch, my boots sinking into the mud. I didn't run, but I wanted to. My truck was only a few steps away. I could leave, pretend I never came. But then I saw the second truck, parked just past mine, half hidden behind the trees. Police truck. The old kind they use in rural areas, mud-splattered, the logo barely visible in the dim light. And that's when it all started to make sense. Whoever was in my cabin was a cop, and they weren't supposed to be here. I stayed still, thinking. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe someone had just used the cabin for shelter. Maybe a hunter, caught in the rain, and the truck belonged to a game warden. But that bag inside, it was military style, heavy duty, and the way the room was left, not like someone resting, but like someone hiding. I should have left then, should have turned around, climbed back into my truck, and driven back down that washed-out road. But I didn't. I took a step toward the second truck, peered through the window, empty. The seats had a jacket thrown over them, a rifle propped against the dash. The radio was off. The keys were gone. That meant whoever drove it was still inside. I turned back just in time to see the cabin door swing open. A man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing dark clothes soaked from the rain. Not a uniform, but there was something about him, the way he moved, the way he carried himself, that told me exactly what he was. He saw me. I didn't move. For a second, we just stood there, watching each other through the downpour. Then he stepped forward, slow, deliberate, like he was deciding something. I backed up. I didn't care who he was. I didn't want any part of it. But he spoke first. Not words, just a low sound, something almost like a sigh. Then he reached into his jacket. That's when I ran. I didn't think, I just moved. Toward my truck, toward anything that could get me away from there. But he was fast, faster than I expected. I hit the mud hard, sliding as my boot caught on a root. By the time I scrambled up, he was there, blocking the way, face half hidden by the rain and the dark. I caught the glint of metal, gun, not pointed at me, not yet, but close enough that it didn't matter. "You need to leave," he said. I shook my head. "This is my cabin." He didn't react, just wiped the rain from his face. And then, too late, I saw the other movement behind him. A second man, stepping out from the shadows near the truck. I didn't wait. I turned, bolting toward the trees, slipping, feeling the burn in my legs as I pushed forward. A shot cracked through the night, splintering wood near my shoulder. I kept going. Branches tore at my arms, mud sucked at my boots, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just ran. I don't know how long I kept moving. The rain blurred everything, turned the world into shapes and shadows. But I knew these woods better than they did. Eventually, the gunshots stopped. The voices faded. They weren't chasing anymore. They didn't need to. They had my truck, my keys. My phone was inside. I was stranded. By the time I made it to the old fire road, my legs were shaking, lungs burning. I kept moving, just one foot in front of the other. Dawn was breaking when I heard the engine. A different truck. A real police truck this time. They found me half dead from exhaustion. Asked me what happened. I told them the truth. About the men, the gun, the shots. They exchanged a look. No sign of them. No truck. No bag. Only my own footprints, leading away from my own empty cabin. They told me I must have been mistaken, that there was no record of any officers in the area. But they were wrong. Someone had been there, someone who wasn't supposed to be, and they had left no trace, except the bullet hole in the tree behind my cabin. I never went back. I never believed in things I couldn't see with my own eyes. My whole life, I relied on facts, evidence, and logic. But nothing in my life prepared me for what happened that winter in the mountains. I had taken a job watching over an old hunting cabin deep in the woods of Montana. The owner, a man I barely knew, paid me well to keep an eye on the place while he spent the winter in Arizona. It was a simple job: keep the firewood stocked, check for storm damage, make sure no squatters tried to move in. Seemed easy. I had spent plenty of time alone before, and I wasn't afraid of the wilderness. The first few weeks were peaceful. The cabin sat at the end of a long, unmarked road, tucked away from the rest of the world. A thick pine forest surrounded it, stretching for miles in every direction. At night, the only sound was the wind through the trees and the occasional howl of a distant coyote. I kept myself busy, chopping wood, reading old books the owner had left behind, hiking in the afternoons. Every few days, I drove into town for supplies, then returned to my solitude. But after a while, I started feeling off. It wasn't fear, at least not at first, just an unease I couldn't shake. At night, I would wake up and feel like someone or something was watching me. The trees outside seemed darker than usual. The wind sounded different, carried something in it, something I couldn't explain. Then I started hearing noises. At first, they were small things: twigs snapping in the woods, rustling leaves. Normal sounds, I told myself, probably just animals. But the noises got stranger. I would hear footsteps circling the cabin late at night, slow and deliberate. Sometimes they stopped right outside the door, pausing for minutes at a time before moving again. One night, I was splitting firewood when I heard my own voice call my name from the trees. I froze. It wasn't an echo. It wasn't a trick of the wind. Something was mimicking me. The voice was flat, empty, wrong. It didn't carry the weight of a real person speaking. It sounded hollow, like a recording played on a loop. I turned back toward the cabin, trying to ignore it, trying to convince myself I had imagined it. But as I reached the door, I heard it again. The exact same voice, the exact same way I had spoken earlier that day. I locked the door and sat by the fireplace for hours, gripping my rifle. The flames crackled, casting long shadows on the walls. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe the isolation was getting to me. But then the smell came. It was foul, like rotting meat left in the sun for days. It seeped in through the cracks in the walls, filling the cabin. It covered my nose, gagging. The stench was thick, heavy, unnatural. I heard the footsteps again, slow and deliberate, moving just outside. Then I heard the knock. It was soft at first, just a tap against the wooden door. Then another. Then another. I didn't move. The knock came again, harder this time. I reached for my rifle, my hands slick with sweat. The fire flickered, casting long, shifting shadows. Then a voice. Not mine this time. It was a woman's voice, soft, distant. "Let me in." I didn't move. I barely breathed. The voice came again. "Please, I'm cold." It was wrong. The way she spoke, flat, lifeless. The words didn't carry the weight of real desperation. They sounded forced, practiced. I stayed silent. The knocking stopped. Then, slow, heavy footsteps moved away from the door. I sat there listening for what felt like hours. The fire burned low. The stink lingered in the air. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn bled through the trees. When I finally stepped outside, the snow around the cabin was disturbed. Deep, heavy footprints circling the structure over and over. But they weren't human footprints. They were long, thin, with clawed toes. That was the night I decided I had to leave. I packed my things, loaded my truck, and started down the long, winding road back to town. The forest was silent. The sky was overcast, gray and heavy. I had made it about 5 miles when I saw something in the trees. A deer. At least it looked like a deer, but it was standing wrong. Its legs were too long, its joints bent in unnatural angles. Its head was tilted, staring at me with dark, empty eyes. And then it spoke. In my voice, "Help me." I slammed my foot on the gas, speeding down the dirt road, barely keeping control on the icy ground. The trees blurred past. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. I didn't stop until I reached town. I didn't go back to that cabin. I never told the owner what happened. I don't know what I saw in those woods. I don't want to know. All I know is that something out there watched me. It waited, it listened, and it wanted me to let it in. I had spent most of my life in the city, where the nights were never truly dark and silence was rare. When my uncle passed away, leaving me his old farm in Nebraska, I didn't know what to do with it. I had visited only a handful of times as a kid, and my memories were vague. Just open fields, a long gravel road, and an old wooden cabin where he had lived alone for as long as I could remember. I had no intention of moving there permanently, but I also didn't want to sell it without seeing it first. So, I took a week off work, packed my truck with supplies, and drove 12 hours straight to the property. It was late September when I arrived. The sky was overcast, and the wind carried a chill. The farm had been abandoned for months, and it showed. The gravel road leading to the house was overgrown, and the surrounding fields were tangled with weeds. The barn's roof sagged, and the cabin itself looked worse than I remembered. Weathered wood, peeling paint, and a front porch that creaked under my weight. I unlocked the door with an old key my uncle had left behind. The air inside was stale, carrying a mix of dust and something else, something faintly rotten. The cabin had only one main room with a kitchen area in the corner, a wood stove for heat, and a narrow hallway leading to a single bedroom and bathroom. The furniture was old but intact, a layer of dust covering everything. I left my bags by the door and opened a few windows to let in fresh air. The fields stretched for miles in every direction, bordered by a thin line of trees in the distance. There were no other houses nearby. The closest neighbor was nearly 5 miles away. As I explored the property, I noticed a few things that made me uneasy. The barn doors were slightly open, despite the heavy chain my uncle used to keep them shut. Inside, the ground was covered in hay and dirt, and I found an old workbench with tools still scattered across it. The strangest part was in the corner, an old wooden ladder leading up to a loft, where a thin mattress lay in the dust. It wasn't my uncle's. I locked up the barn and checked the cabin again. The back door had a sliding bolt, which I secured. The windows had locks, though some were rusted. I didn't expect trouble, but something about the place made me uneasy. That night, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. I sat at the kitchen table, eating a sandwich and flipping through a notebook I had found on a shelf. It was my uncle's handwriting, mostly notes about farm maintenance, weather patterns, and supply lists. But towards the end, his notes became stranger. Saw something near the tree line again. Thought it was a coyote, but it was standing still, watching. Heard footsteps outside the cabin last night. Checked the barn this morning. Nothing was missing, but I feel like someone's been here. I don't go out after dark anymore. I closed the notebook and set it aside. My uncle had lived alone for years. Maybe he had started imagining things. That night, I slept with a loaded rifle beside the bed. The mattress was old, the cabin too quiet. Every small creak made me tense. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke to a sound outside, something moving through the leaves. I listened, holding my breath. It wasn't the wind. It was slow, deliberate. Footsteps. I reached for my rifle and got up as quietly as I could. Peeking through the bedroom window, I saw nothing at first. Then, near the barn, I caught a glimpse of movement. A figure, just barely visible in the dark. It stood near the entrance, motionless. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Then, it stepped back, disappearing into the darkness. I stayed up until dawn, every sound making my pulse hammer. As soon as the sky lightened, I stepped outside, rifle in hand. The ground was damp from the night air, and near the barn, I found footprints, barefoot. The prints led towards the fields, vanishing in the tall grass. I checked the barn again. The ladder to the loft was slightly pulled out, like someone had used it recently. The mattress had a fresh indentation. I wasn't alone out here. That day, I debated leaving, but something in me didn't want to be chased off. I spent the afternoon securing the property, double-checking the locks, making sure every door and window was secure. I even set up a tripwire near the barn entrance, a simple can with stones inside, tied to a length of fishing wire. Night came too fast. I sat inside, lantern on, rifle on the table. The air was thick with silence. Then, just past midnight, the can rattled. I grabbed my rifle and moved to the window. The barn door was open again, swinging slightly in the wind. Then I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the field, just within the shadows. Watching, I raised the rifle, but it didn't move. For what felt like hours, I stared, waiting for it to come closer. But it never did. It just stood there. Eventually, exhaustion won. I backed away, locked the door, and waited out the night. By morning, the figure was gone. The barn door was closed again. The footprints remained. I packed my bags. I left that afternoon, locking the cabin behind me. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Near the barn, in the tall grass, something moved. I never went back. I pulled my truck off the narrow dirt road and into the clearing, the tires crunching over frozen leaves. The sky was a dull, washed-out gray, the sun already sinking behind the thick line of trees. It was late October, and the cold had started settling in. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. 3 days alone at the hunting cabin. Just me, the woods, and the quiet. The cabin wasn't much. Just a single-room structure, rough-hewn from old timber, with a tin roof and a stone fireplace. It had been in my family for decades. My grandfather built it when he was young, and my father spent years maintaining it. Now it was mine, or at least I was the only one who still used it. It sat deep in the woods, a good 20 miles from the nearest town. No power, no running water. Just a pump outside for drinking and a wood stove to keep the cold away. I stepped out of the truck, stretching my legs after the long drive. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. I took a deep breath and grabbed my gear from the bed of the truck. My rifle, a backpack full of food, and my sleeping bag. I walked up to the cabin, pushing open the heavy wooden door. The hinges groaned from the cold. Inside, the air was stale, but everything was just as I left it. A thick layer of dust covered the small table by the window. The cot in the corner was still there, the wool blanket folded neatly on top. I set my things down and checked the fireplace. Still some old ashes from the last time I was here. I went back outside to gather firewood before it got too dark. The forest was silent, except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I moved quickly, grabbing as many dry logs as I could carry and hauling them inside. It didn't take long to get a fire going, the flames crackling and throwing long shadows across the wooden walls. The warmth filled the room, chasing away the damp chill. I made a quick meal, just a can of beans heated over the fire, and sat back in the old wooden chair near the window. The woods outside were dark now, the sky a deep black. No moon, no stars, just endless trees. That first night passed without much incident. I slept lightly, waking up a few times to the sound of the wind pushing against the trees. It was always a little unsettling being out there alone, but I had done this enough times to push that feeling aside. The next morning, I woke before sunrise, rolling out of the cot and stepping outside. The cold hit me immediately. The ground was hard, frost clinging to the fallen leaves. I pulled on my jacket and grabbed my rifle. Hunting had been slow the past few years. Too many people hunting too close to the roads, pushing the animals deeper into the woods. I had to hike out further each time if I wanted any luck. I set out just as the sun was beginning to rise, my boots crunching against the frozen ground. I walked for hours, following the trails I knew well. Nothing. No tracks, no movement. The woods were too quiet. Even the birds seemed scarce. It wasn't until late in the afternoon that I finally spotted something. A fresh set of deer tracks, leading down toward a small stream. I followed them carefully, moving slow, keeping my breathing steady. After another 20 minutes, I saw it. A buck, standing just beyond a thick line of trees. It was big, at least an 8-pointer. I raised my rifle, lined up my shot, and pulled the trigger. The crack of the rifle echoed through the trees, and the deer bolted. I knew I hit it, but it didn't drop. Instead, it disappeared into the brush. I cursed under my breath and started moving. Tracking a wounded deer was always a pain, especially as the sun was already starting to dip lower in the sky. I found a trail of blood, leading deeper into the woods. I followed it for what felt like miles, deeper than I had ever gone before. The trees grew denser, the undergrowth thick. The farther I walked, the more uneasy I felt. Something about this area felt off. I had hunted here for years, but I didn't recognize this part of the forest. I kept going, my rifle tight in my hands. The trail of blood led to a small clearing, and that's when I saw it. The deer was there, lying still, but something had gotten to it first. Its body was torn open, deep gashes running down its sides. The head was twisted at an unnatural angle. Whatever did this wasn't another hunter. It wasn't an accident. The woods were silent. No wind, no birds, just the sound of my own breathing. I knelt down, my eyes scanning the trees. There were no tracks, no sign of what had done this. But I knew I wasn't alone. I turned back the way I came, moving faster than before. The sun was almost gone now, and I didn't want to be stuck out here in the dark. Every sound in the forest felt amplified. The crunch of my boots, the rustling of leaves. Then, behind me, I heard it, a branch snapping. Not from the wind, not from an animal. Something heavy. I didn't stop to look. I just kept moving. My heart was pounding, my hands gripping my rifle so tight my knuckles were white. The cabin was still a long way off, but I forced myself to keep going, pushing through the undergrowth, ignoring the burning in my legs. I could feel it. Something was behind me, moving when I moved, stopping when I stopped. I wasn't imagining it. By the time I saw the faint outline of the cabin through the trees, I was nearly running. I burst through the door, slamming it shut behind me, throwing the heavy wooden bar across it. My chest was heaving, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I stood there for a long time, listening. Nothing. I moved to the window, my hands shaking as I pushed the curtain aside just enough to see outside. The trees were still. The yard was empty, but just beyond the tree line, in the deep shadows where the firelight didn't reach, something was there, couldn't see it, not fully. Just a shape darker than the rest of the night. Tall, motionless, watching. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, my rifle in my lap, waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing did. By the time the first light of dawn came, the shape was gone. I left that morning, packed up my things and drove out of there, not stopping until I was miles away. I don't know what I saw out there. I don't know what tore that deer apart. All I know is that I never went back to that cabin again. I was 36 when I decided to take a break from everything. My job, my city life, my routines. I wanted a change, even if it was just for a few weeks. So, I rented a small cabin deep in the forests of Montana. It wasn't a vacation rental or some fancy lodge. It was an old, abandoned hunting cabin that I got for cheap through a guy I knew. He said it hadn't been used in years, but it was still sturdy. No electricity, no running water, just an old fireplace, a well outside, and a generator that barely worked. That was exactly what I wanted. I had packed enough supplies to last me a few weeks. Canned food, dried meat, bottles of water, a hunting rifle, a sleeping bag. My plan was to disconnect, spend time alone, maybe do some hunting and just exist in the quiet. I had grown tired of the constant noise of the city, the traffic, the deadlines, the people. I wanted to be alone. The drive took nearly 6 hours from the nearest town. The last stretch was a rough, unpaved road that barely seemed drivable. The further I went, the more I realized how deep into the woods I really was. By the time I arrived, the sun was setting, and the air had turned crisp. The cabin was exactly as described, small, weathered, surrounded by tall pines. It was built from thick logs, with a slanted tin roof that looked rusted but sturdy. The door was stiff and the windows had thick shutters. It was cold inside, but I started a fire in the old stone fireplace and quickly got settled. I wasn't scared. I had camped alone before. I had hiked deep into forests without seeing another soul for days. Being isolated didn't bother me. That first night, I fell asleep to the sound of the wind moving through the trees. The next morning, I stepped outside with my coffee and took in my surroundings. The forest stretched in every direction. Tall pines, thick undergrowth, the faint sound of birds. The air was fresh, clean. There were no trails, no roads, no signs of human life. I spent the day getting things in order. I checked the well outside, it was still good. I made sure my rifle was loaded and spent some time cleaning the cabin, clearing out old leaves and dust. Felt good, peaceful. That afternoon, I went hunting. I wasn't looking for anything big, just small game. I moved deeper into the woods, rifle slung over my shoulder, following old animal trails. An hour in, I came across tracks, large, deep, human. I stopped. They weren't mine. I had my own boot prints to compare them to, and these were bigger, wider, and they were fresh. I stood there for a moment, listening. The forest was quiet, not completely silent, but off. The usual rustling of squirrels, the distant calls of birds. It was all faint, far away, like the forest itself had moved back. I kept walking, telling myself it was nothing. Hunters came through these woods, trappers, maybe even hikers. It wasn't strange to find footprints, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was out there. I headed back before dark. That night, as I lay in my sleeping bag by the fire, I thought I heard something outside. Not the wind, not an animal. Something moving, slow, deliberate. I sat up, heart pounding. The sound stopped. I listened for a long time. Nothing. The next few days, I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was just being paranoid. But every time I went outside, I had the feeling I was being watched. It wasn't just in my head. I found more tracks closer to the cabin. Then I started noticing small things. My axe, which I always left by the chopping block, had been moved. My canteen, which I kept on the porch, was suddenly on the ground. And then there were the nights, each one worse than the last. The noises got closer. Footsteps, slow, heavy, deliberate. The sound of something brushing against the cabin walls. One night I heard breathing. I was lying there, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it just outside the wall. Deep, slow breathing. I grabbed my rifle and sat up. The breathing stopped. The footsteps faded. I didn't sleep after that. By the 5th day, I had made up my mind. I was going to leave. That morning, I packed my bag and got everything ready. But before I left, I decided to do one last sweep of the area. I walked a small perimeter around the cabin, looking for tracks. I found something worse. A dead deer just outside the tree line. His throat had been cut. Not torn by an animal, cut, clean and precise. And someone had arranged it. Its legs were bent at odd angles, its head twisted unnaturally. I stood there staring at it. Then I smelled it. Not the deer. Something else. Sweat, dirt, something rotten. I turned slowly. There, between the trees, just barely visible in the morning light, someone was standing. Tall, thin, dressed in dark, ragged clothes. I couldn't see his face, but I knew he was looking at me. I didn't move. Neither did he. Then he took a step forward. I turned and walked back to the cabin, forcing myself not to run. Inside, I locked the door and grabbed my rifle. My hands were shaking. I had seen a lot of things in my life, but nothing that made my stomach twist the way that figure did. I waited. Hours passed. Nothing. But I knew he was still out there. That night, I kept the fire low. I stayed near the door, rifle in hand. Around midnight, I heard it. Footsteps, closer than ever. Then the handle on the door rattled. I raised the rifle, heart hammering. The door didn't open, but the footsteps didn't leave. I waited, muscles tense, until the first light of dawn. When I finally opened the door, he was gone. But he had been there, standing outside all night. That was enough. I packed my bag, got into my truck, and left without looking back. I never reported it, never told anyone. But I know this, whoever he was, he had been watching me the entire time. And he hadn't been alone. When I checked my rearview mirror, just before I hit the main road, I saw them. 3 figures, standing at the edge of the woods, watching, waiting. I never went back. The road leading to the cabin was worse than I remembered. Gravel shifted beneath my tires, making every turn feel unsteady. The rain had softened the dirt, turning patches of the path into thick, sucking mud. The trees on either side of me were dark and wet, their twisted branches reaching over the road like skeletal hands. I hadn't been here in years, not since my husband passed. But now I had no choice. I had avoided his cabin for as long as I could. It was his place, not mine. He had spent years using it as a retreat, somewhere to clear his head after long weeks working as a crime officer. He had always kept things from me, things about his job that he thought would be too much for me to handle. But I knew it wasn't just about protecting me. He didn't want me involved. He didn't want me knowing what went on in his world. After he died, I had tried to keep moving forward. I avoided anything that reminded me of him too much. But now I was here. I had been sent a letter, an official-looking envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sentence, typed neatly on a piece of white paper. Go to the cabin. I hadn't told anyone I was going. It was easier that way. If nothing came of it, I could leave and pretend this never happened. The sky darkened as I drove further into the forest. The rain came down harder, pounding against the windshield, making it difficult to see. My headlights reflected off the mist rising from the ground. The road narrowed, trees pressing closer on both sides. Then finally I saw it. The cabin sat at the end of the road, hidden behind the thick tree line. It was exactly the same as I remembered, small, sturdy, built from dark wood. The windows were shut, the porch sagging slightly from years of neglect. I pulled up and killed the engine. For a moment, I just sat there, listening to the rain hammering against the roof of the car. I stepped out. The air was damp, thick with the smell of wet earth and rotting leaves. My boots sank slightly in the mud as I walked up the steps. The key still worked. It turned in the lock with a soft click, and the door creaked open. Inside, everything was untouched. Dust covered the wooden floorboards, the furniture, the small kitchen counter. His things were still here. His jacket hanging on the back of a chair, his boots resting by the door. It felt like stepping into a time capsule, like he had just been here and would be back any minute. I moved carefully through the space, taking it all in. Then I saw the desk. It sat in the far corner of the room, covered in old files, stacks of paper yellowing at the edges. I walked over, brushing dust off the surface. Most of it looked like routine reports, case notes, printouts, handwritten memos. But then, at the bottom of a pile, I found something different. A leather-bound notebook. I opened it, flipping through the pages. His handwriting filled every line, neat and precise. The first few entries seemed normal: dates, locations, observations. But then the notes changed. The handwriting became rushed, uneven. Words were underlined, some circled aggressively. He had started writing about a case, something he had been investigating off the books. I kept reading. The details were vague, but I could tell he had been tracking someone. He described late-night visits to this very cabin, meetings with unknown individuals. He wrote about feeling watched, about finding things moved when he was sure he had left them in place. Then the final entry: "If anything happens to me, they'll come here. They know I know. I can't let them find it." My stomach twisted. Find what? I looked around, suddenly hyper-aware of my surroundings. The cabin felt different now, heavier. I walked to the kitchen, checking the cabinets. Nothing. I searched under the bed, behind the bookshelf. Still nothing. Then, I noticed the floorboards near the desk. One of them looked loose. I knelt down and pried it open. Inside was a small metal box, rusted and old. My hands trembled as I lifted it out and set it on the desk. The latch was stiff but gave way under pressure. Inside were photos, black and white, grainy, taken at night. They showed a man, tall, thin, always half hidden in the shadows. In some, he was standing by a car. In others, he was near a house. The last photo made my blood run cold. It was the cabin. The man stood just outside, near the trees, staring directly at the camera. My breath caught in my throat. I flipped through more. There were documents beneath the photos, names, addresses, notes scrawled in my husband's writing. He had been tracking this man, or had the man been tracking him? The sound of rain outside filled the silence, steady and rhythmic. But then, beneath it, I heard something else. Footsteps. I froze. They were slow, deliberate, moving just outside the cabin. I turned off the lamp and moved toward the window, keeping low. The trees swayed, casting shifting shadows in the dim light. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned the darkness. Then I saw him. A figure stood just beyond the tree line, tall, unmoving, watching. I gripped the box tightly, my mind racing. The letter. Someone had wanted me to come here. Someone had known I would find this. The figure didn't move. The rain dripped from the trees, running in thin streams down the window pane. I backed away slowly, my breath shallow. I needed to leave. Now, I grabbed the metal box and slipped out the back door, moving quickly toward my car. My keys were already in my hand. my fingers fumbling in the wet darkness. I climbed in, locked the doors, and started the engine. Headlights cut through the rain as I backed out. I glanced in the rearview mirror, my heart hammering. The figure was gone. I didn't stop driving. Not until I was miles away from that place. The box sat on the passenger seat beside me, its rusted edges digging into the fabric. I didn't know what to do with it, not yet. But I knew one thing. Whatever my husband had discovered, it hadn't died with him. It was late October when I finally arrived at the cabin. A long, slow drive through the winding roads of the Vosges Mountains had left me exhausted, but there was still work to do before I could rest. The rental was a small, old wooden place deep in the forest, far from the nearest town. The last time someone had stayed there was months ago, according to the owner. It had been a cheap find, and I needed the break. A week in isolation, away from the noise of the city, sounded like exactly what I needed. The air was damp, thick with the scent of wet leaves and pine. The sky was dark by the time I parked my car, the last light of day fading behind the trees. The cabin itself looked old but sturdy, its walls weathered from years of harsh winters. A single bulb above the door flickered weakly, barely illuminating the porch. There was no signal on my phone, something I had expected but still found unsettling. I carried my bags inside, the wooden floor creaking under my weight. The interior was simple. A small kitchen, a worn-out couch, a fireplace that hadn't been used in a long time. The bedroom was small, just a bed and a nightstand. I locked the door behind me and checked the windows. The place was silent except for the occasional rustle of the wind against the trees. After unpacking, I stepped outside to grab more firewood from the shed behind the cabin. The night was eerily quiet. No birds, no insects, just the faint rustling of the trees. It felt like the forest was holding its breath. The shed was a few meters from the back door. I reached it quickly, feeling the cold seeping through my jacket. The inside smelled of damp wood and earth. I grabbed a few logs, but as I turned to leave, I noticed something odd. The door had been slightly ajar when I arrived. Now it was fully open. I stared at it for a moment, my mind trying to rationalize it. The wind, maybe, but the air was still, and the door had been heavy when I pushed it open. I stepped out, glancing around the darkened trees. Nothing, just shadows stretching between the trunks. Back inside, I locked the door again. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. I built a fire in the fireplace, the warmth finally chasing away the cold. The flames flickered, casting long, shifting shadows along the wooden walls. I tried to read, but my mind kept drifting back to the shed door. Something about it didn't sit right with me. The feeling lingered as I lay in bed later that night, listening to the wind whisper through the trees. Sometime in the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The fire had died down, and the room was colder than before. The air felt heavy, thick. Then I heard it, a slow, deliberate creak from somewhere outside the bedroom door. My breath caught in my throat. I stayed still, straining to hear. Another creak, then silence. I reached for the flashlight on the nightstand. Clicking it on, I aimed it toward the doorway. The bedroom door was slightly open. I was sure I had closed it before going to bed. I sat up slowly, listening. Nothing, just the sound of my own breathing. I stepped out of bed, flashlight shaking slightly in my grip. The living room was dark, the fireplace just a pile of dying embers. The front door was still locked. I checked the windows, all closed. Then my eyes fell on the back door. It was unlocked. I had locked it. I was sure of it. I stood frozen, my mind racing. Had someone been inside while I slept? I felt exposed, standing there in the dark, so I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a fire poker from next to the fireplace. I stepped forward, slowly reaching for the door handle. I pulled it open and shined my flashlight outside. The forest was silent. The shed door was closed. I could see my car parked where I left it. Nothing seemed out of place. I checked around the cabin, but there were no footprints in the damp earth. If someone had come inside, they had left no sign of it. I locked the door again and sat by the fire until morning, barely getting any sleep. The next day, I tried to shake the feeling of unease. I forced myself to go about my plans, hiking the nearby trails, taking in the scenery, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I stopped to rest, I felt it, a strange awareness, like something just beyond my vision was keeping track of my movements. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. I lit another fire, cooked a small meal, and tried to distract myself with a book. But the feeling never left. That night, I made sure every door and window was locked before going to bed. I still woke up. It was the same feeling, like something had woken me, but I didn't know what. Then I heard it, a soft, barely audible sound from outside the bedroom. I turned on my flashlight again, but this time, I noticed something immediately. The bedroom door, it was wide open. I had closed it before sleeping. I was certain. My stomach turned to ice. I listened, heart pounding. Silence. I took a deep breath and stepped out. The living room was empty. The fire had died down again, casting everything in deep shadows. Then I saw the back door, wide open. My hands went numb. I had locked it. I knew I had. I didn't move. I listened. The air was dead silent. Then, from the darkness outside, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, careful steps moving just beyond the tree line. Not running, not retreating, just moving, watching. I stayed still, gripping the fire poker so tightly my fingers ached. My mind was screaming at me to do something. Close the door, turn on every light, run to the car, but I couldn't move. Then the footsteps stopped. I don't know how long I stood there. 5 minutes? 10? An hour? I didn't know. Then I heard something worse. The sound of slow, deliberate breathing. Not mine. Something else. Just outside. I don't remember making the decision to move. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and backed away. The fire poker was useless. I needed something else. A knife, anything. I grabbed my keys, not even bothering to pack. I ran to the car, jumping in and locking the doors. My hands shook as I turned the key in the ignition. As my headlights flickered on, they caught something standing at the edge of the trees. A figure, motionless, too far to make out details, but close enough that I knew it had been watching me. I didn't stay to see what it would do. I threw the car into gear and sped off down the dirt road, my tires kicking up mud and leaves. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. I never went back to that cabin. I didn't tell the owner what had happened. I didn't want to think about it. I still don't. But I think about that figure in the woods. I think about how long it had been watching me. And worst of all, I think about what would have happened if I hadn't woken up that night. The rain had started in the afternoon, and by evening it was coming down hard. Thick drops pelted the tin roof of my truck, a steady, drumming sound that seemed to get louder with every passing hour. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, the kind of deep, woody scent that only comes when the ground has been soaked through. My boots were already covered in mud, my jeans damp from kneeling in the wet soil, but I had work to do, and I wasn't about to stop just because of the weather. I had been hired to put up a small hunting cabin out in the woods, a good 10 miles from the nearest paved road. The land belonged to a guy named Tom, a friend of a friend who had money to burn and wanted a secluded getaway deep in the forest. He had cleared a rough path leading in, but other than that, the land was untouched. Thick trees surrounded the site on all sides, their dark trunks forming a wall against the outside world. I liked that about the place. There was something peaceful about working alone out here. Just me, the trees, and the sound of rain. By the time the sun had set, I had most of the frame up. The skeletal outline of the cabin stood against the darkening sky. Beams of wet would slick with rain. I had planned to work into the night, get as much done as possible before heading back to town for the night, but the storm was getting worse. The wind was picking up, rattling the trees and making the rain come down sideways. My fingers were numb from the cold, my tools slick and hard to grip. I figured I had maybe another hour of work in me before I had to call it quits. The problem was, I wasn't looking forward to the drive back. The dirt road leading in was already turning to mush, deep tire tracks filling with water. If I waited too long, I'd end up stuck, and there wasn't a soul for miles who could pull me out. I figured I had two choices: either leave now while I still could, or stay the night in my truck and wait for the road to dry out in the morning. I decided to stay. I wasn't in the mood to fight the mud, and besides, I had everything I needed to make it through the night. The truck had a full tank of gas, I had a cooler full of food, and I was used to roughing it. I had slept in worse places than the cab of my truck. The rain kept falling, hammering against the windshield as I leaned back in the seat, trying to get comfortable. My coat was damp, my clothes sticking to my skin, but eventually, the warmth of the truck helped shake off the chill. I pulled a blanket over me, listening to the sound of the storm. It must have been around midnight when I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had pulled me out of sleep. The rain was still coming down, steady as ever, and the wind was still howling through the trees. But something felt different. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, trying to shake off the grogginess. The truck's interior was dark, the windows fogged from my breath. I reached for the key in the ignition, turning it just enough to power on the dash lights. A soft glow filled the cab, and that's when I noticed it. The woods were silent. The rain was still there, the wind still moving through the trees, but the usual sounds of the forest were gone. No insects, no rustling leaves, no distant hoots from an owl. Just a heavy, oppressive silence pressing in from all sides. I didn't like it. I cracked the window just a bit, letting in the cool night air. The rain pattered against the side of the truck, but beneath that, I thought I heard something else. Something faint. A sound that didn't belong. A branch snapping. I turned off the ignition, plunging the truck back into darkness. My heartbeat was suddenly louder than the rain, a steady thudding in my ears. I reached for the flashlight I kept in the glove compartment, but I didn't turn it on just yet. Instead, I waited, listening. Another sound, closer this time, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps in the wet leaves. I wasn't alone. I cursed under my breath, slowly shifting to get a better view through the windshield. The rain had made the glass slick and blurry, but through the distortion, I saw movement. A shape, someone, something, standing at the edge of the trees. I froze. It wasn't an animal. It was too tall, too still. Person, just standing there, barely visible in the dim light. I should have turned the truck on right then. I should have thrown it into gear and gotten the hell out of there. Mud be damned. But I didn't. I don't know why. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was fear. Either way, I just sat there watching. Then the figure moved. Slowly, it stepped forward, out of the trees and into the clearing where the half-built cabin stood. The rain made it hard to see details, but I could tell it was a man. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing dark, soaked clothing that clung to his frame. He walked with a deliberate, steady pace, his movements slow and unhurried. I reached down, gripping the handle of the knife I kept in the door pocket. My fingers were stiff with cold, but I forced myself to hold on tight. I wasn't the kind of guy who's scared easy, but something about this wasn't right. He wasn't calling out. He wasn't waving for help. He was just walking, straight toward me. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned the key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life. The headlights flicked on, cutting through the rain, and for the first time, I saw his face. I wish I hadn't. His skin was pale, almost gray, his features weathered and drawn. His eyes were dark, sunken, staring straight at me without blinking. His clothes were old, tattered, covered in mud and grime. But it wasn't his appearance that made my stomach drop. It was the look in his eyes. I had seen a lot of things in my life. I had met good people and bad people, but I had never seen eyes like that. Empty, like he wasn't even human. I slammed the truck into reverse, tires spinning in the mud as I backed away from the half-built cabin. The man didn't move. He just stood there, watching, as I turned the wheel and gunned it down the dirt road, mud spraying up in thick clumps as the truck struggled for traction. I didn't stop driving until I hit pavement. I never went back to finish the cabin. The guy who hired me sent another crew a week later. They said the place was fine, nothing out of the ordinary, just an empty construction site. But I know what I saw, and I know deep down that if I had stayed that night, if I had hesitated just a little longer, I wouldn't be here to tell the story. Some places you just aren't meant to be, and some people you just aren't meant to meet. I never liked being alone in the woods, not because of the silence or the dark, but because of what people could do when they thought no one was watching. It was late October 2017 when I took the job watching over a remote hunting cabin deep in the Appalachian Mountains. The owner, a man I barely knew, was paying me to stay there for a few weeks, check the place for damage, and make sure no squatters moved in before hunting season started. It seemed like easy money. I had just gotten out of a bad relationship, lost my apartment, and needed something to keep my mind occupied. Living off-grid in a quiet cabin sounded like a good way to reset. The place itself wasn't much. A small, one-room wooden cabin with a metal roof, a wood stove, a bunk bed, and a tiny kitchen with an old propane stove. The only way in or out was a long dirt road that turned to mud when it rained. No electricity, no running water, just a rain barrel outside and a small outhouse about 20 yards from the door. I arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun was dipping below the tree line. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp leaves and pine. I parked my old truck beside the cabin, grabbed my duffel bag, and unlocked the heavy wooden door. The inside smelled like dust, aged wood, and old smoke from the last fire in the stove. I checked every corner, every shadow, making sure no animals or people had taken shelter inside. Everything was where it should be. The first couple of nights were uneventful. I spent my days chopping firewood, hiking the nearby trails, and reading by lantern light. At night, I listened to the sounds of the forest, owls, rustling leaves, the occasional crack of a branch. Nothing unusual, nothing that made me feel uneasy. Then, on the third night, something changed. I was lying in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, when I heard a noise outside. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving through the damp leaves just beyond the cabin walls. I held my breath, my pulse hammering in my ears. I told myself it was just a deer, maybe a bear. But then the footsteps stopped, right outside the cabin door. I sat up, gripping the hunting knife I kept beside my bed. My truck was parked outside. If someone had made their way all the way up here, they knew someone was inside. For a long minute, there was nothing. just the sound of my own breathing. Then the slow creak of the wooden porch steps. I stayed completely still. The only weapon I had was the knife, and that wasn't much against a gun. If they were just checking to see if the cabin was occupied, maybe they'd leave. Maybe they'd think I was asleep. Then the doorknob turned. It wasn't a test. It wasn't someone accidentally wandering up here. Whoever was outside was trying to come in. I moved quietly, stepping off the bunk and onto the wooden floor without making a sound. My heart was hammering against my ribs. The doorknob stopped moving. Then silence. Whoever it was, they were still out there, listening, waiting. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The only sound was the distant hoot of an owl somewhere deep in the trees. Then soft footsteps on the porch, moving away. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the lower bunk, knife in hand, staring at the door until the first light of dawn crept through the cabin windows. When I finally stepped outside, the damp earth was covered in footprints. Large, booted footprints, too big to be mine. Whoever had been outside wasn't some lost hiker. They had been watching. I should have left, packed my things, got in my truck, and driven back to town. But I didn't. The man who hired me was paying good money to stay until the first week of November, and I needed that cash. Instead, I walked around the cabin, checking the perimeter. The footprints led from the tree line to the porch, then back into the woods. No sign of a vehicle. Whoever it was had come on foot. That day, I chopped more firewood, kept my mind busy. But as soon as the sun set, I felt it again, that sense of being watched. The fifth night, it happened again. This time, I was ready. I kept my lantern on low, sitting in the chair by the wood stove, watching the door. Just past midnight, I heard the footsteps. Slow, careful. They stopped just outside the door. Then silence. A long pause. A minute, maybe two. Then the slow creak of the porch steps as they moved away. This time, I didn't wait for morning. I grabbed my flashlight, my rifle, and stepped onto the porch. The air was cold. The woods were silent. I aimed my flashlight toward the trees, following the tracks in the dirt. My breath came out in white puffs. Then I saw it, a figure, standing just beyond the trees, not moving, not trying to hide, just standing there, watching. I couldn't see the face. The beam of my flashlight barely reached them, but I saw the shape of a man, tall, wearing a hooded jacket. I gripped my rifle tighter. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then the figure turned. Without a word, without a sound, they disappeared into the trees. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I made my decision. I packed my bag, loaded my truck, and started the engine. I didn't care about the money. Whatever was going on out here, it wasn't worth it. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The cabin stood silent, smoke curling from the chimney, and just beyond the tree line, half hidden in the shadows, was the figure, watching. I never went back. I had been working in law enforcement for over a decade, most of it spent tracking organized crime. My job had taken me into dark places, drug dens, human trafficking rings, illegal arms deals, but none of those prepared me for what happened that last time. It was 2017, late October, and the days were getting shorter. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones had already started setting in. The case had been going on for nearly a year. A deep investigation into a smuggling ring that operated out of a remote cabin. At first, we weren't sure what they were running. Guns, drugs, stolen goods. Maybe all of it. Whatever it was, people went in and not all of them came out. The cabin sat deep in the woods, far from the main road. It was one of those places no one paid attention to. No close neighbors, no security cameras from nearby houses. Just trees, mud, and a structure that had been standing for who knows how long. It had been owned under different names over the years, but always under false identities. I was part of the team sent in for the takedown. We had everything set up, weeks of surveillance, logs of who went in and out, tracking vehicles in the area. We even had a rough idea of the layout. The cabin had a main building, a shed in the back, and a small garage on the side. No one went near the shed unless they were dragging something heavy. That was one of the things that didn't sit right with me. The night of the operation, we moved in quietly. The plan was to catch them off guard. We assumed there would be at least 5 of them inside, maybe more. No time for mistakes. Moving through the woods at night wasn't easy. The damp ground made every step sink into the earth, and the cold air was thick with the smell of wet leaves and pine. We had to be careful. If we stepped on the wrong branch, the snap would carry through the trees. As we got closer, I could see a faint light coming from the cabin's windows. A few voices inside, low and muffled. One of them laughed. It didn't sound forced or nervous. These people weren't expecting trouble. The plan was to breach the front and back at the same time. No warning, no time for them to react. We stacked up against the walls. My breathing was steady, but I could feel my pulse in my throat. We moved. The front door blew open with a heavy kick, and the back door was forced just as hard. We rushed inside. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Something metallic, like rust, mixed with cigarette smoke and stale beer. 3 men were at the table. One of them jumped up, reaching for something at his waist. We moved faster. Before he could pull his weapon, he was down. Another one reached for a shotgun leaning against the wall. He didn't make it. I scanned the room. The third guy had frozen, hands up, but he wasn't our biggest concern. There were more rooms. We moved down the hall. One door open, a bedroom, empty. Another door slightly ajar. Something was inside. I went first. The room was dark, but there was a faint outline of a bed, a table. Someone was in the corner. I could barely make them out at first. My flashlight cut through the dark, and I saw him. A man in his 50s, shaking, eyes wide. He wasn't one of the guys we were after. We secured him, then kept moving. The last door at the end of the hall led to the basement. One of my guys signaled me he'd heard something below. Someone moving. Slow, careful. I moved down the stairs first. They creaked under my weight, the air getting colder as I went. At the bottom, the room opened up into a concrete space. Metal shelves, boxes, a workbench covered in tools, and something else. A tarp pulled over what looked like a large wooden crate. Then I saw movement. A man stepped from the shadows, something heavy in his hand. Before I could react, he swung. The edge of whatever he was holding glanced off my shoulder, but the force of it knocked me back. He lunged again, but I was quicker. The fight was over in seconds. I took a deep breath, my shoulder aching. Then I looked at the crate. I pulled the tarp away. Inside, there were bones. Human bones. Not just one person. More. Some of them still had scraps of clothing, dark stains. Some had been there longer than others. The realization hit me all at once. This wasn't just a smuggling operation. These men weren't just running guns or drugs. They had been doing something else. Something worse. I turned away and signaled the others. More men were coming in now, securing the scene. The cabin was ours. But I couldn't stop looking at that crate. We found more outside. The shed we had been watching for weeks. It wasn't for storage. It was a dumping ground. Some of the bodies were old, nothing left but bones. Some weren't. By the time the operation was over, we had 6 bodies accounted for. Maybe more, buried deeper in the ground. The men we arrested never gave us a full answer. They wouldn't say why. Some things, I think, are better left unknown. The cabin was torn down a month later. Nothing remains of it now. No evidence that anything ever happened there. But I remember it. Every detail. It was the last operation I ever worked. It was early November, and the rain had been coming down for days. I had been staying at my uncle's old cabin in the mountains, a place I had visited on and off for years. It wasn't a luxury spot, just a small wooden structure with one bedroom, a kitchen, and a tiny bathroom that barely functioned. The plumbing was unreliable, and the electricity came from an old generator that hummed constantly in the background. I had come out here to clear my head, to get away from the noise of life. My job in the city had worn me down, and after a rough breakup, I figured isolation was what I needed. My uncle had passed away the year before, and the cabin had been sitting empty. It seemed like the perfect retreat. The first few days were peaceful. I spent my time chopping wood, fishing in the nearby river, and reading by the dim lantern light when the generator decided to act up. The cold mountain air was crisp, the smell of wet earth and pine filling my lungs every time I stepped outside. Then the rain started. At first, it was a steady drizzle, the kind that makes you want to stay inside with a blanket and a book. But soon, it became a relentless downpour, soaking the ground, turning the dirt road into thick mud, and making the entire forest seem darker than usual. The sound of raindrops hitting the metal roof of the cabin was constant, droning, almost hypnotic. On the third night of rain, I noticed something strange. It was late, maybe around midnight. I had just finished eating and was sitting by the small wood stove, staring at the flames, when I heard something outside. It wasn't an animal. I knew what deer, raccoons, and even bears sounded like. This was different, slow, deliberate footsteps. I sat still, listening. The footsteps stopped just outside the cabin. I reached for the old hunting rifle my uncle had left behind. I wasn't a great shot, but I knew how to use it. My heart was pounding as I stood up and moved toward the window. The rain made it hard to see, but I could just make out a figure standing near the tree line. A man. He wasn't moving, just standing there in the rain. I didn't turn on the outside light. I didn't want to give away my position. Instead, I watched him for what felt like forever. He didn't have a flashlight. He wasn't wearing a raincoat. He was just standing there in the dark, drenched. I waited. He didn't move. Finally, I stepped away from the window. I kept the rifle close and sat back down, listening. The rain drowned out most other sounds, but I swore I could hear something. Faint breathing, just outside the wall of the cabin. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, the rain had let up a little. I stepped outside cautiously, scanning the tree line. The man was gone. The ground was soaked, but there were footprints in the mud. Not animal tracks, human. I told myself he was just a lost hiker, someone who had wandered too far and got caught in the storm. But something about it felt off. If he was lost, why didn't he call out for help? Why stand there, watching? The next night, I barricaded the door. Not that it would do much good. The lock was old, the door itself thin. But it made me feel a little safer. It didn't matter. Just past midnight, I heard the footsteps again. This time, closer. I turned off the lantern and sat in the darkness, rifle in hand, listening. The rain was coming down hard, but I could hear him moving, circling the cabin. Then the doorknob rattled. Slow, deliberate. I raised the rifle, aiming at the door, my finger on the trigger. Silence. Then, after what felt like forever, the footsteps moved away. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest, but they didn't return. When morning came, I found fresh tracks in the mud, deep, close to the cabin. The man had been standing just outside my door for hours. That was it. I packed my things. I had planned to stay another week, but I wasn't going to risk another night. The road was a mess, thick with mud and barely drivable, but I forced my truck through it. My tires spun, the engine roared, but I got out. I never looked back. Later, I told myself I had overreacted, that maybe it was just a lost traveler, someone too afraid to knock. But deep down, I knew the truth. Whoever he was, he hadn't been lost. He had been waiting. It started as a simple weekend getaway. My gym partner, Darren, had invited me up to his family's old hunting cabin for a few days of hiking, lifting, and just getting out of the city. We'd been training together for years, spotting each other on heavy squats, pushing through plateaus, and sharing post-workout meals. When he mentioned he had a place up in the woods, I didn't think much of it. Just sounded like a good chance to break from routine, get some fresh air, and put ourselves through some old-school, Rocky-style training in the wilderness. The cabin was about a 4-hour drive from the city, tucked away in the middle of nowhere. No cell reception, no neighbors, just trees and hills stretching for miles. The last hour of the drive was all dirt roads, the kind that made you second-guess whether you were still on the right path. When we finally pulled up, the cabin looked like it hadn't been used in years. Wood-paneled walls, a slanted tin roof, and a porch that creaked under our weight as we stepped onto it. Inside, it was simple. A couple of cots, a wood stove, an old fridge that didn't work anymore, and a heavy wooden table that looked like it had been around since Darren's grandfather built the place. There was a dusty barbell set pushed into the corner, which made me laugh. Of course, even out here, Darren had to have weights. We unpacked, set up our sleeping bags, and spent the first few hours doing what we always did, training. It felt good, sweating under the open sky, the weight of a loaded barbell pressing into our backs as we squatted in the dirt. Afterward, we ate, cooled off in a nearby stream, and sat on the porch as the sun started setting. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet you don't get in the city. Just the sounds of crickets, the rustling of trees, the occasional snap of a branch somewhere in the distance. By nightfall, the air had cooled, and we moved inside, lighting an old oil lamp. Darren had brought some jerky, protein bars, and a few cans of food, but we weren't planning on a feast. Just enough to get by for the weekend. The plan was simple. Wake up early, train, hike, maybe try hunting even though neither of us were good at it. But things didn't go as planned. That first night, I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. At first, I thought it was Darren, but when I turned my head, I could see him still lying in his cot, his deep breathing steady. I listened. The sound wasn't close, but it was out there, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, something heavier than an animal but lighter than a person. Circled, moving through the brush, stopping, then continuing again. I sat up, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, my heart pounding a little harder now. I didn't like that I couldn't see it. Whatever was out there, it was keeping just far enough away that it stayed hidden in the dark. I reached over and nudged Darren. He grumbled, shifting, but didn't wake up. I debated waking him, but the noise had stopped. I sat there, listening, staring at the blackness outside the window, waiting for it to start again. But it didn't. Eventually, I lay back down. It took me a long time to fall asleep. The next morning, I mentioned it to Darren over breakfast. He shrugged it off, saying it was probably a deer. I wasn't so sure. I'd heard deer before. They were quick, jittery. This was different, slower, intentional. We pushed it aside, spent the morning training again, and decided to hike deeper into the woods. There was an old trail behind the cabin, overgrown but still walkable. Darren led the way, and we pushed through thick branches and uneven ground, climbing steadily higher. About an hour in, we came across something strange. In a small clearing, there was a pile of bones, not scattered like an animal had been eating them, but stacked, carefully arranged. Some were small, maybe rabbit or squirrel, but others were larger, possibly deer. They were stripped clean, bleached white by the sun. Neither of us said anything at first, just stood there staring. "That's weird," Darren muttered, kicking at the dirt. I nodded. Weird was an understatement. We kept moving. It was probably some hunter, we told ourselves. Some guy who had a weird habit of stacking bones instead of just leaving them. We didn't talk much for the rest of the hike. That night, the sound came back. This time, it was closer. I woke up again, that same slow movement outside. But now I could hear breathing. Not mine, not Darren's. Something else. Deep, heavy breaths. I tensed, gripping the knife I'd brought just in case. The air inside the cabin was thick, stifling. My skin felt clammy. I barely breathed as I listened. The breathing was just outside the window. I turned my head slowly, my pulse hammering in my ears. I couldn't see anything in the darkness, but I could feel it. Someone or something was right there, just beyond the thin wooden wall. Then a light tap, fingernails against the glass. Not knocking, just testing. I swallowed hard, every muscle in my body locked up. Then silence. I stayed awake until dawn. Darren didn't believe me when I told him. He laughed, said I was psyching myself out. I didn't push it, but I wasn't going to stay another night. We packed up, but before we left, I checked around the cabin, and that's when I saw them. Footprints, not boots, not shoes, bare feet, dozens of them. They circled the cabin, overlapping, pressing deep into the dirt. Some were small, like a child's. Others were much bigger, and they led off into the woods, disappearing into the thick trees. I didn't say anything, just got in the car and waited for Darren. We never went back. A few weeks later, I looked up the area. It had a history, missing people, hikers who had vanished without a trace, rumors of some kind of cult living deep in the forest, away from civilization. I don't know who or what was out there that night. I don't want to know. All I know is that something was watching us, and it wanted us to know it was there.